They dragged her trunk into the middle of Red Hollow's main street and split it open with an axe. That was how Clara Whitmore arrived in the West. Not with a welcome, not with a handshake, but with the sound of iron splitting wood and the laughter of 30 strangers picking through the only things she had left in the world. Harlan Briggs, the man who owned half the buildings on that street, stood over her broken trunk with his boot pressed against her mother's quilt and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Somebody send this girl back to wherever she crawled out of. We got no use for dead weight out here." Clara was 23 years old. She had traveled 11 days to get here, and she had nowhere else to go. If you've ever stood somewhere and felt the ground disappear beneath your feet, not because you fell, but because everyone around you decided you didn't deserve to stand, then you already know what Clara felt in that moment. This is her story. And if you want to know how a woman they called worthless became the one person who saved them all, stay with me until the very end. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Because the stories we tell here don't flinch, and they don't end the way you expect. Drop a comment below and tell me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, and if it moves you, hit that like button. It means more than you know. The morning Clara arrived in Red Hollow, the sky had that particular shade of pale that comes before real heat sets in. Not quite white, not quite blue, something in between that promised the day would be unforgiving. She'd ridden the last 40 miles in the back of a supply wagon, seated between 2 crates of flour and a coil of rope that smelled like wet animal. The driver, a quiet man named Ebb, hadn't spoken more than 6 words to her the entire way. He'd taken her fare coin without looking at her face and kept his eyes on the trail. That was fine. Clara had learned not to expect much from strangers. What she hadn't expected was Harlan Briggs. She heard him before she saw him. A voice built for giving orders in large spaces, thick with the kind of confidence that comes not from earning it, but from never having been told no. When Ebb pulled the wagon to a stop near the far end of the main street, Harlan was already standing in front of the general store with 2 other men, watching the wagon like he'd been waiting. Clara climbed down carefully, her legs stiff from the ride, and reached back up for her trunk. It was a modest thing, dark brown, brass clasps, a small dent on the left corner from the time it fell off the back of a coach in Missouri. It held her clothes, her tools, her mother's quilt, and a small leather journal where she kept observations about soil and weather and the way certain plants behaved in dry seasons. Everything she owned that mattered. She got the trunk halfway to the ground before one of Harlan's men stepped forward and grabbed the other end. Not to help her, she realized immediately, but to take it. The trunk hit the dirt hard, and before Clara could say a word, Harlan had already pulled an axe from the side of a hitching post and swung it down. The sound split through the morning. People stopped. A woman across the street turned from her sweeping. 2 cowboys near the feed store looked up from their horses. A boy who couldn't have been older than 8 froze mid-step, his mouth open. Harlan Briggs crouched down and pushed the broken lid aside with the toe of his boot. He lifted the leather journal first, held it up between 2 fingers like it was something he'd found in mud, and then dropped it. He picked through a folded dress, a small wrench, a trowel with a wooden handle. He found the quilt and pressed his boot down onto it. "Farming tools," he said, looking back at his men with something approaching disgust. "She brought farming tools." He looked at Clara then. "Where do you think you are, girl? What exactly were you planning to do out here?" Clara's mouth was dry. Her hands had gone cold despite the heat. She looked at her journal in the dirt and then at Harlan Briggs's face, and she said very quietly, "I was planning to work." The laughter started with his men, moved to the people nearby, and spread down the street the way sound carries on a still morning. Not everyone laughed. A few people looked away, which was almost worse, but enough did that the noise felt like something physical, like being pushed. Harlan shook his head slowly. "Work." He said the word like it had a bad taste. "You hear that, boys? She's going to work." He looked at Clara again. "Do yourself a favor and get back on that wagon. Go back to wherever you came from. Red Hollow doesn't need another mouth that can't pull its own weight." Clara stood very still. She had a choice to make in that moment, and she knew it. She could turn around. She could ask Ebb to take her back. She could fold herself back into the idea that maybe she'd been wrong to come here, wrong to think there was something in this valley she could build into a life. It would have been the easier thing. It would have made sense to a lot of people. Instead, she crouched down and began putting her belongings back into the broken trunk. She didn't say anything. She didn't look at Harlan. She gathered the journal first, then the dress, then the trowel, and she fit them back in with the careful precision of someone who had packed and unpacked this trunk in difficult circumstances before. Her hands were shaking, but she kept them moving. The quilt was harder. It was heavy, and Harlan's boot had left a dark mark on one corner. But she folded it and pressed it down into the trunk and closed the broken lid and held it shut with both hands. When she stood up, Harlan Briggs was still watching her. "I heard there was work in this valley," she said, "and I intend to find it." What? She'd heard about Red Hollow from a woman named Dorothea Ashe, who she'd met at a boarding house in Laramie the previous autumn. Dorothea had been married to a cattle rancher out there for 6 years and was heading back after a visit east to see her sister. She had a broad, sunburned face and a directness that Clara liked immediately. "It's not easy country," Dorothea had told her over supper. "The winters are real winters. The summers aren't much kinder. But the land, Clara, the land is something. And they need people who understand how to work it, not just how to own it." Clara had been working as a laundress in Laramie since she was 19, taking on mending and alterations when the laundry was slow. She was good with her hands, good at observation, good at figuring out what something needed even when it couldn't tell her directly. Plants, animals, soil. She'd grown up reading all of it, raised by a father who farmed without formal education, but with the kind of patient intelligence that comes from paying close attention for decades. He'd died the previous spring. The farm had been sold to cover debts she hadn't known existed. And Clara had found herself in Laramie with $42, a trunk, and the uncomfortable understanding that the life she'd expected was not going to happen. Dorothea's description of Red Hollow had planted something in her. Not hope exactly. She was too careful for that. But a sense of possibility that she hadn't felt in months. She'd written to a ranch owner named Elias Trent, whose name Dorothea had given her, asking about work. He'd written back a short letter. "Come if you're willing to earn it." That was enough. She hadn't known about Harlan Briggs when she left Laramie. She hadn't known that Elias Trent had sold half his operation to Harlan 6 months ago, and that the dynamic in Red Hollow had shifted considerably since Dorothea had left. She hadn't known that the town had contracted around Harlan's money like a muscle around a splinter, tight and uncomfortable, but unable to quite let go. She learned all of this in the first 3 days, in pieces, from people who would talk to her in fragments and then look away, as if being seen being kind to her was a risk they weren't willing to take. The room she rented was in a boarding house on the east end of the main street, run by a woman named Vera Paulson, who had the narrow, watchful face of someone who had survived too many winters by saying as little as possible. Vera hadn't laughed when Harlan split the trunk. She hadn't looked away either. She'd watched with an expression Clara couldn't read. She charged Clara $4 a week, which was more than the room was worth, and showed her to a space at the back of the house that had one window, a bed frame with a thin mattress, and a washstand with a cracked basin. The floor was uneven. There was a smell of mice. "Breakfast is at 6, Vera said. "Supper at 7. You miss it. You go hungry. I don't keep food out." "That's fine," Clara said. Vera lingered in the doorway. "Harlan Briggs is not a man who forgets," she said, not looking directly at Clara. "Just so you know." "Neither am I," Clara said. Vera looked at her then, a quick, assessing look, and left without another word. That first night, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and opened her journal and wrote 3 pages. Not about the humiliation in the street or the laughter or Harlan's boot on her mother's quilt. She wrote about the valley she'd seen from the wagon coming in, the way the land lay in long, sweeping stretches that told her things about where water moved and where it didn't, where the soil would be deep and where it would be shallow, where the sun hit longest in the afternoon. She wrote about the color of the grass on the western slope, which was darker than the eastern side, and suggested something about drainage that she wanted to look into further. She wrote until her candle was low, and then she slept. Elias Trent's operation sat about 2 miles outside of town, what was left of it, which was a modest cattle herd, 3 hired hands, and a farmhand named Gus, who had worked the land for 20 years and regarded Clara's arrival with the same enthusiasm he might have given a second drought. Elias himself was a tired-looking man in his late 50s with a white mustache and a handshake that told you he used to be stronger. He received Clara at the front of his property on her second morning in Red Hollow, looked her over with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to make quick judgments about most things, and pointed her toward the equipment barn. "I wrote that I wanted someone willing to earn it," he said. "I meant it. I don't give charity out here, but I also don't turn away someone who can actually work. That's all I'm asking for," Clara said. The three hands, Dewey, a red-faced man in his 40s, Pete, who was younger and said almost nothing, and an older man everyone called Fitz, who had a limp from an old break that hadn't healed right, received her with varying degrees of hostility. Dewey's was the most straightforward. On her first morning, when she showed up to help with feeding, he put down his bucket and looked at her and said flatly, "You ever worked cattle before?" "Not cattle specifically," she said. "I've worked livestock, and I've worked soil." "Well," he said, picking up his bucket again, "I guess we'll see how long that lasts." He wasn't wrong to be skeptical. She wasn't good at everything from the start. There were moments in those first weeks that were genuinely hard, tasks where her lack of specific experience showed clearly, and she didn't pretend otherwise. She moved slower than the others on certain things. She asked questions when she didn't know, which some people respected and some people used as evidence of her inadequacy. But there were other things. There were things she noticed that the others walked past every day without seeing. The first happened about 10 days after she arrived. Elias's herd had been losing weight steadily for about 3 weeks. Not dramatically, not so fast it was alarming, but enough that Dewey was starting to worry about the fall sales. He'd checked the water, checked for disease signs, changed the grazing area twice. Nothing had helped. Clara had been watching the cattle since her first day, the way her father had taught her to watch anything you wanted to understand, without trying to fix it yet, just watching. She noticed the way certain animals in the herd avoided a particular section of the grazing field, hanging at the far edges even when the grass there looked the same as anywhere else. She got down on her knees in that section of the field one morning and dug with her trowel about 8 inches into the soil. What she found was a layer of gray clay that shouldn't have been there, compacted, impermeable, sitting right beneath the root depth of the grass. Water was pooling in it after every rain and then fermenting slightly before it drained, and the grass roots on top were pulling something from that layer that the cattle were tasting and didn't like. The grass looked fine. The problem was underground. She brought the trowel to Elias that evening with a small sample of the clay and explained what she'd found and what she thought could be done about it. A simple drainage cut along the north edge of that section, which would redirect the pooling water and give the layer a chance to dry out and break down. It would take 2 days of work and cost almost nothing. Elias looked at the clay for a long moment. "The boys have been over that field 3 times, he said. "I know," Clara said. "They were looking for what they expected to find. I didn't know what to expect, so I looked at everything." He was quiet for a moment. "Where did you learn this?" "My father," she said. "He farmed 40 years without a single formal lesson. He just paid attention." Elias had the drainage cut done by the end of the following week. Within a month, the herd had gained back what it had lost, and then some. Dewey didn't apologize. He wasn't the type for it. But he stopped leaving her out of the morning planning meetings, which was something. The town was a different matter. Red Hollow wasn't a cruel place by nature. It had the ordinary proportion of good and bad that most small places carry. People who would give you their last flour in a hard winter, and people who would shortchange you at the store and not lose sleep over it. But it had contracted around Harlan Briggs's money in a way that made cruelty convenient and kindness risky. When Clara came into the general store, conversations lowered or stopped entirely. When she sat at the table in the back of the Paulson house for breakfast, the 2 other boarders, a traveling goods salesman named Morrison and a young man named Carter who worked at the livery, ate with their eyes on their plates. Not hostile exactly, just absent, like she wasn't quite there. The person who made her feel most like she existed was Colt Mercer, and their introduction had not been graceful. He'd been in the saloon, or at least coming out of it, on the 4th evening after Clara arrived, when Harlan's men had followed her up the street from the store and started making comments. Nothing that crossed into direct violence, but the kind of steady, low commentary that was designed to make a person feel unsafe, to remind them that they were tolerated only at someone else's discretion. Clara had kept walking. This was the strategy she had settled on. Keep walking, Keep her eyes ahead. Don't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She'd made it almost to the end of the block when one of the men, a wide, tobacco-stained individual named Rudd, stepped ahead of her and planted himself in the middle of the boardwalk. "Where are you rushing off to, sweetheart?" he said. "We're being friendly." Clara stopped. "Please move," she said. "Maybe I will," Rudd said. "Maybe I won't." She heard the saloon door open behind her and didn't turn around. "Rudd!" The voice was flat, not loud. It was the kind of voice that doesn't need volume because it's already decided something. Rudd looked up past Clara. His expression did something complicated. "This ain't your business, Mercer." "I'm making it my business." Footsteps on the boardwalk, not rushed. "She asked you to move." "She's nobody," Rudd said. "She's the girl Harlan." "She's not a joke," the voice said, and now he was standing beside her, and Clara could see him for the first time. A tall man, weathered in the specific way that the frontier weathered people who took it seriously, with dark eyes that were currently fixed on Rudd with an expression of complete patience. "She's a person. Move." Rudd moved. He did it with the careful resentment of a man who is calculating what he can afford to do and concluding, this time, that the answer is nothing. He stepped off the boardwalk into the street and walked away, and his companions followed, and Clara stood very still until they were gone. She turned and looked at Colt Mercer. He wasn't looking at her with pity, which was the first thing she noticed. He looked at her the way he'd looked at Rudd, straight, assessing, without drama. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Rudd's a coward with an audience. He'll think twice now." "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't." He went back into the saloon. What? She asked Vera Paulson about him that evening. Vera was in the habit of sitting in the front room after supper with a cup of something and a book she rarely seemed to read, and Clara had learned that if she came in quietly and didn't push, Vera would sometimes talk. "Colt Mercer," Vera said, and something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, but a kind of measured respect. "He's been in Red Hollow going on 4 years. Came through on a cattle drive, decided to stay. He's worked 3 different outfits, never had a problem doing it. He's the best horseman in the valley, which most people around here would agree with, even if they didn't like him." "Do people not like him?" Clara asked. "People are careful with him," Vera said, which was not the same thing. "He doesn't belong to Harlan. That makes him unpredictable to people who've gotten used to knowing which side of things everyone stands on." She paused. "He was married once. Woman named Anne. She died 2 winters back. Influenza." Clara absorbed this. "He lives alone?" "He has a small place north of town, keeps to himself mostly." Vera looked at Clara over her cup. "He stepped in for you tonight. That'll cost him something." "I didn't ask him to," Clara said. "No," Vera said. "That's the point." It cost him, as Vera had said. By the end of that week, 2 of the outfits that had been quietly considering hiring Colt for the fall gather had let the work go to other men. One of Harlan's people had mentioned casually in the right conversations that Colt had been making trouble. That was all it took. Clara only found this out because Fitz told her, Fitz who said almost nothing and seemed to see everything, while they were working on a fence section on Elias's north boundary one afternoon. "That Mercer," Fitz said, not looking up from the wire, "lost 2 jobs this week." Clara's hand stilled on the post she was bracing. "Because of me?" "Because of Harlan," Fitz said. "Mercer made the choice himself. She didn't know what to do with that. She kept it in her chest for several days. The specific weight of knowing that someone had paid a price on her behalf without asking her permission, and that there was no clean way to address it. She went to find Colt the following Sunday. He was at the north edge of town, working on a section of his fence line when she walked up. He heard her coming and didn't stop what he was doing. "I heard about the work," she said. "I'm sorry." He hammered a staple into the post, checked its hold, and looked at her. "I'm not asking you to be," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." He studied her for a moment. That same straight, unadorned look. "You going to stay?" he asked. "I'm not leaving," she said. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not a smile. Something quieter than that. "Then you'd better start teaching yourself which ranchers around here are worth talking to and which ones aren't. Because Harlan's going to keep coming, and you're going to need to know this place better than you do." It was the most he'd said to her at once. She sat down on the fence rail and got out her journal and said, "Then tell me." He looked at the journal. He looked at her. He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a reluctant laugh, though it didn't quite get there. And he talked. That Sunday afternoon on the fence line turned into something neither of them had planned for. Colt talked for nearly 2 hours, not in the way that some men talk, filling space, circling the same point, performing their own knowledge, but with the specific economical clarity of someone who had spent years sorting what mattered from what didn't. He told her which ranchers in the valley were honest, which ones were honest only when it was convenient, and which ones had stopped pretending. He told her about the water situation, how the 3 main streams that fed the valley all converged on land that Harlan Briggs was quietly acquiring piece by piece, the way a man might collect cards from a deck without letting the other players notice. He told her about the smaller homesteaders on the valley's western edge, the Sutter family and the Reinhold family, and a widower named Ambrose Hale, who'd been farming the same 40 acres for 22 years, people who didn't have Harlan's money or his connections but who had something Harlan didn't, which was actual knowledge of the land and how to keep it producing. Clara wrote in her journal while he talked. Not everything, she couldn't keep up, but the parts that connected to things she'd already been noticing, the parts that explained what she'd been seeing without yet understanding. At some point, Colt stopped talking and looked at what she was writing. "You draw maps?" he said. "It's not really a map," she said, turning the journal so he could see. "It's more like I mark where things connect. Water, soil, weather patterns, who owns what. It's easier for me to understand a place when I can see how its parts relate to each other." He studied the page for a long moment. She noticed that he was actually reading it, not just glancing at it the way people do when they want to appear interested. "You learned this from your father," he said. It wasn't a question. "He never drew anything," she said. "That part's mine. But the way of thinking about it, yes." Colt handed the journal back. "Most people look at one thing at a time," he said. "Harlan counts on that." She looked at him. "What does Harlan count on exactly?" "That people will see what's right in front of them and not what's coming," Colt said. "He's been buying up the creek rights for 2 years. Nobody's put it together because each sale looks small. The Denning family sold their creek access last spring. They needed money for a roof, and Harlan made it easy for them. The McAllister brothers sold their water rights on the North Fork the winter before, one by one. Nobody connected them." He paused. "Until now." "You connected them," Clara said. "I noticed," he said. "Noticing and doing something about it are 2 different things. I'm one man without land or money in a town where Harlan Briggs decides who works and who doesn't." Clara closed her journal. "Then you need more people who've noticed." He looked at her with that expression she was starting to recognize, the one that was neither optimistic nor dismissive, just genuinely uncertain about what to make of her. "You've been here 2 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm still right." The weeks that followed were not triumphant. That is worth saying plainly, because the story of a person who overcomes adversity can make it sound as though the overcoming happens in a clean, forward line, setback to victory, each stage building neatly on the one before. That was not how it went for Clara Whitmore in Red Hollow. What happened was messier and slower and punctuated by days where she went back to her room at Vera Paulson's and sat on the edge of that thin mattress and questioned every decision she'd made since leaving Laramie. Days where her hands hurt and her back hurt, and the look on Dewey's face when she'd gotten something wrong stayed with her past dark. Days where she overheard something in the general store, a comment, a laugh that stopped when she walked in, and felt the specific exhaustion of being the person that everyone has already decided about. She did not let those days change her direction, but she felt them, fully. She had been working at Elias Trent's operation for just over a month when the second problem appeared. This one harder than the first, and more public. Elias had a mare named Sable, who was in foal and had been for longer than she should have been. The local man who served as the closest thing Red Hollow had to a veterinarian, a leathery individual named Doc Pierce, who treated horses and humans with roughly equal bedside manner, had been out twice and concluded both times that the foal was positioned correctly and would come when it was ready. He'd said this with the confidence of a man who has made the same assessment so many times that he stopped checking whether it's accurate. Clara had been watching Sable for 3 days. She watched the way the mare stood at the far end of the paddock, away from the other horses. She watched the specific way she held her weight, which was different from what Clara had seen in horses close to a normal delivery. She watched the way Sable's breathing changed in the evenings, and then returned to something like normal in the mornings, which suggested something intermittent was happening internally that wasn't resolving. On the fourth evening, she went to Elias. "The foal is turned," she said. "Not badly, but enough. Doc Pierce is looking at her position from the outside. The problem is inside." Elias looked at her with the expression of a man who is tired and doesn't want another problem. Doc Pierce said, "I know what he said," Clara said. "I think he's wrong. I think if we wait another day or two, we're going to lose the foal and possibly the mare." The silence that followed was the kind where you can hear what the other person is deciding. "What do you want to do about it?" Elias said finally. "I want to try to turn the foal tonight," she said. "I've assisted with this before, twice, with my father. I won't pretend I'm a veterinarian, but I think I'm right about what's happening, and I think waiting is the worst risk." Elias rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the paddock. "If you're wrong—" "If I'm wrong and we lose the mare, that's on me," she said. "I'm asking you to let me try." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Fitz stays with you." "That's fine," she said. It took 3 hours, and it was not clean or straightforward, or anything like the 2 previous times she'd assisted with the turned foal, because every animal is different and every difficulty is its own shape. Fitz held the lamp and handed her what she needed without speaking, and there was a period somewhere around the 2nd hour where Clara was not at all sure she was right about any of it, where her hands were shaking inside the examination, and her certainty had gone somewhere she couldn't locate, and she was working on something closer to committed stubbornness than confidence. The foal came just before midnight. A filly, dark like her mother, legs that seemed impossibly long as she figured out the ground beneath her. Sable turned and smelled her, and the tension in the paddock changed entirely. Fitz lowered the lamp. In the quieter light, his old face looked something other than neutral for the first time. "Your father taught you that?" he said. "He taught me to stay until the thing was finished," Clara said. Her arms ached to the shoulder and her knees were stiff from the cold ground. "The rest I figured out as I went." Fitz made a sound that was unmistakably a sound of respect. Elias came out in the morning, looked at the filly, looked at Sable, and looked at Clara with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. "All right," he said. That was all. But it meant something. Dewey heard about it from Fitz and said nothing directly to Clara. But 2 days later, when Pete was struggling with a section of irrigation ditch that kept collapsing on one side, Dewey said, without looking at Clara, "Ask her. She'll know why it's doing that." Pete looked at Clara. Clara looked at the ditch. "The soil on that side has too much sand in it," she said. "It doesn't hold a bank well. You need to bring in some clay from the lower field and pack it in before you build the bank up again." Pete tried it. The bank held. It was not a grand moment. No one made a speech. But something had shifted in the way the 3 hired hands looked at her, and Clara felt it, and it mattered to her more than she would have admitted. The problem with small shifts is that they don't protect you from large ones. Harlan Briggs had not forgotten Clara Whitmore. That was the thing about Harlan. He operated on a long timeline, because his money gave him the patience that other people couldn't afford. He didn't need to act immediately. He could let a person get comfortable and then move. He moved in early October. Elias Trent came in from town one Friday afternoon looking older than he had that morning. He sat down at the table in his front room and put his hat on the table and looked at it for a while before he said anything. Clara happened to be at the edge of the room, returning a set of tools she'd borrowed. She almost left. Something in Elias's posture made her stay. "Harlan came to see me today," Elias said. She waited. "He's calling in the note on the east pasture," Elias said. "I borrowed against it 3 years ago, when prices were down. The note's due in 60 days. He paused. "If I can't pay it, he takes the land." Clara sat down across from him. "How much is the note?" He told her. She kept her expression neutral but felt the number land heavily. It was not impossible, but it was close. "The east pasture is where the creek runs through," she said. "Yes," Elias said. "He doesn't want the pasture," she said. "He wants the creek access." Elias looked at her. "I know that," he said. There was no bitterness in it, just the weariness of a man who has watched something coming and could not find a way to stop it. She spent that evening in her room going through her journal, looking at the map she'd been building of the valley's water situation. What had started as a rough sketch of Colt's information had grown into something more detailed over the weeks. Creek paths and ownership boundaries, rainfall patterns she'd tracked, notes on which sections of the valley were drawing from which sources. She had added to it in pieces, the way you build a picture of something complicated, one observation at a time. Looking at it now, she could see what Harlan's collection of creek rights and water access was building toward. He was assembling control of the valley's water not all at once, but in the sequence a careful man uses. The less noticed pieces first, the strategic ones last. Elias's East Pasture Creek was near the end of that sequence. Not the last piece, but close. She thought about Dorothea Ashe telling her that the valley needed people who understood how to work the land, not just own it. She thought about her father walking the edges of his fields in the early morning, not because he was worried, but because he liked to know what was there. Then she picked up her journal and went to find Colt Mercer. I was at the saloon when she got there, not drinking, or not much, just sitting at a table near the back with a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold and a look on his face that suggested he was somewhere else in his thoughts. He came back when she sat down across from him. She put the journal on the table and opened it to the map. Harlan's calling in Elias's note, she said. East Pasture, 60 days. Colt looked at the map. His jaw tightened slightly. He's moving faster than I expected. He's moving because I'm there, Clara said. Elias's place is where I'm working. Whatever small things I've been doing that have started to matter. Harlan sees that. He's not going to wait until I've established something real. Colt was quiet for a moment. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about the Sutter family and the Reinholds and Ambrose Hale, she said. The smaller landowners on the west side. Harlan hasn't gotten to their water rights yet because their pieces seem less valuable from the outside. But if he gets the East Pasture Creek and the McAllister North Fork water he already has, she traced a line on the map. He controls the primary flow into the western section. Their smaller creeks dry up in a hard summer without that upstream volume. Colt leaned forward and looked at the map more carefully. They don't know this, he said. No, she said, because nobody's shown it to them in a way they can see. He looked at her. You want to go talk to them? I want us to go talk to them, she said. You know them. They know you. They don't know me yet, and I'm already the woman Harlan publicly humiliated, which means walking in alone, I'm either a nobody or a problem, depending on who's in a worse mood. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but related to one. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since the second week I was here, she said. He sat back, looked at the coffee, looked at the map. If we go talk to those families and Harlan finds out, and he will find out, it stops being about the note on Elias's pasture. It becomes something bigger. It's already something bigger, Clara said. We're just the only ones who've noticed. They went on a Tuesday, when Colt had no work scheduled and Clara had finished her morning tasks at Elias's place. Colt brought his horse and borrowed a second one for Clara from a man he trusted, a quiet arrangement made without drawing attention. The Sutter farm was the first stop, a modest operation about 4 miles west of town, where a couple in their late 40s named Bert and May Sutter ran a mixed situation of cattle and crops with 2 sons who were still young enough to be more help than hindrance. Bert Sutter was a compact, serious man with the permanent squint of someone who spends most of his time outdoors assessing weather. May was taller than her husband, moved with the efficiency of a person who has learned to get 3 things done in the time most people spend doing one. Colt had known them for 3 years. They received him at the front of the house with the particular warmth people reserve for someone they trust in a country where trust is not given freely. They received Clara with politeness that was careful and reserved. Not unkind, but provisional. Clara understood provisional. She didn't try to move faster than it allowed. She let Colt lead the conversation for the first 20 minutes, catching up on the things neighbors catch up on. The fall weather, the cattle prices, a fence dispute between 2 families a few miles north that everyone in the valley had opinions about. She listened and watched and got a sense of Bert Sutter's rhythm. He was deliberate, didn't like to be pushed, respected evidence over argument. When Colt turned the conversation toward the water situation, he did it the way you turn a boat, gradually, without making the turn itself the thing everyone's looking at. Been hearing anything from the McAllister side about their North Fork? He said. Bert's expression shifted slightly. Heard they sold the water rights, he said. Last winter sometime. They didn't make a noise about it. They sold them to Harlan Briggs, Colt said. Bert looked at him. I didn't know that. Most people don't, Colt said. That's been Harlan's way of doing it. One at a time, quiet. He nodded toward Clara. She's been mapping it out. She can show you what it looks like when you put all the pieces together. Bert Sutter looked at Clara with the expression of a man who is revising a preliminary judgment. Not enthusiastically, he'd formed the judgment for reasons, and revising it took something from him, but genuinely. Clara put the journal on the porch railing and opened it to the map. She didn't explain herself first. She just showed him. She walked him through it the way her father had walked her through complicated things, starting with what he already knew, building from there to what connected, letting the connections do the work rather than trying to tell him what to conclude. She pointed to the North Fork that the McAllisters had sold. She pointed to the Denning family's creek access that Harlan had gotten the previous spring. She showed him the East Pasture note he was calling in on Elias. If those three pieces come together under one owner, she said, the water flowing into the western section in a dry summer drops by roughly a third. Maybe more. She pointed to the Sutter land on the map. Your small creek doesn't have the volume on its own to carry through a hard July. Bert Sutter looked at the map for a long time. May had come to stand beside him, and she was looking at it too, and her expression was harder to read than his, more interior, but not less engaged. How do you know this? Bert said finally. I've been watching the water patterns since I got here, Clara said, and I grew up on land where my father had to understand water to survive it. Some of this is observation. Some of it is just putting what I see in one place together with what I see somewhere else. You're the woman from Elias Trent's place, May said. Yes, Clara said. May looked at her for a moment. I heard about the mare, she said. Sable. That was, yes, Clara said. Bert's cousin lost 2 mares last year to bad positioning, May said. Could have lost both. Doc Pierce told him they were fine. Something shifted in her expression. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. The Reinhold farm was harder. Karl Reinhold was a German immigrant in his 60s who had been farming his section of the valley for 15 years and had the particular stubbornness of a man who had built something against significant odds and did not appreciate being told it might be in danger. He received Colt neutrally and Clara with open skepticism, and when she brought out the journal, he looked at it with the expression of a man being handed something he suspects is a trick. You draw nice pictures, he said. His accent was still thick. What does this have to do with my farm? If Harlan Briggs controls the upstream water sources, Clara said, keeping her voice level, your creek doesn't have the flow to sustain your herd through a dry summer. You'd have to reduce your cattle numbers or haul water, which costs money you'd spend better elsewhere. Harlan Briggs does not tell me what to do, Carl said flatly. No, Clara said. He doesn't tell you. He just arranges it so that the choice you're forced to make happens to be the one that helps him. Carl looked at her with the deep, assessing look of a man who has learned to separate cleverness from truth. And what do you want from me? Nothing right now, she said. I just want you to know what's coming so it doesn't surprise you. He was quiet for a long moment. His wife, a small woman named Hilda, who had not spoken, refilled his coffee cup without being asked. Why? He said finally. You don't know me. I don't know you. Why do you care what happens to my farm? Clara thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was complicated, and she didn't dress it up. Because what happens to your farm and the Sutter's farm and Ambrose Hale's place and Elias Trent's place all connects, she said. Harlan isn't collecting land because he wants land. He's collecting control. And once he has it, this valley works for him, or it doesn't work. She paused. I came here because I thought this was somewhere a person could build something that mattered. I'd like that to still be true. Karl Reinhold looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the map again. Show me the North Fork piece again, he said. Ambrose Hale was different from both of them. He was a lean, quiet widower of about 60, who moved slowly and said less than anyone Clara had met since coming to Red Hollow, which was saying something in a region where people were generally economical with words. His 40 acres were the best kept Clara had seen outside of Elias's operation. Everything in its place. Evidence of a man who did things right, not to impress anyone, but because he couldn't stand doing them wrong. He listened to everything Colt said, and everything Clara said, and everything the map showed without asking a single question. When they finished, he looked out at his fields for a while. "I know about the North Fork," he said. "I noticed when the McAllisters sold. I didn't know who bought it." "You didn't ask?" Colt said. "I asked Elmer McAllister," Ambrose said. "He got uncomfortable and changed the subject. I took that as my answer." He was quiet. "I've been watching the water levels on my creek for about 18 months. They're lower than they should be for the rainfall we've had." He looked at Clara. "I thought it was the drought cycle, but that's not all of it, is it?" "No," Clara said. "Someone has been diverting small amounts from the upstream sources for at least a year. Not enough to be obvious, enough to matter over time." Ambrose nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd suspected without wanting to be right about. "What's the play?" he said. Clara glanced at Colt. He gave her the slight nod that meant she should answer. "We need to help Elias retire the note," she said. "If Harlan gets the East Pasture Creek, the position he's building becomes very hard to challenge. The smaller landowners on the west side need to understand that Elias's situation and their situation are not separate." She paused. "And someone needs to start the conversation about an irrigation cooperative, a shared system that doesn't run through any single landowner's property, including Harlan Briggs's." Ambrose Hale looked at her for a long moment. "An irrigation cooperative," he said. "There's an old spring in the mountains north of the valley," Clara said. "I've been reading the topography in my journal. It's abandoned. Nobody's used it in years, possibly because nobody knew what to do with it. The elevation is high enough that gravity could pull the water down into a shared channel that reaches most of the western section without touching any of the land Harlan controls." She pulled the journal open to a different page. Rougher calculations, slope estimates, rough measurements she'd taken on the rides she'd done through the valley on her days off. It would take significant work, but it wouldn't take Harlan's permission. The silence that followed had a different quality from the silences that came before. This one was the silence of a man doing serious arithmetic. "You've been here how long?" Ambrose said. "Going on 2 months," Clara said. He looked at Colt. "She for real?" "Far as I can tell," Colt said. Ambrose Hale looked back at Clara. Then he looked at the mountains to the north. "I know where that spring is," he said. "I found it about 12 years ago when I was running a lost calf up into the high ground. Never knew what to do with it." Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not excitement exactly. She'd learned to be careful with excitement, which moved too fast and landed you in trouble. But something closer to the first clear note of a thing that might actually work. "I'd like to see it," she said. "I can take you up there," Ambrose said. He looked at Colt again. "Both of you." They went the following Saturday. It was a 4-hour ride into the high ground north of the valley, on trails that were not quite trails anymore. Paths that animals had kept open by using them, now that no one else had a reason to. Clara rode with her journal across her knee, making notes on the landscape as they climbed, the kind of notes that would have seemed obsessive to someone watching, but that she knew she would need later, when the details that felt obvious today became hard to reconstruct. Colt rode beside her most of the way. He didn't talk much on the trail, which she'd come to understand was not unfriendliness, but a kind of presence. He paid attention to the country around them with the same quality of attention she paid to the land below. And in that shared habit of looking carefully, they had found, without discussing it, a kind of ease with each other. At one point, the trail narrowed and they rode single file for about half a mile, Ambrose in front, and Clara found herself thinking about how strange and specific the shape of things had been. The trunk split in the middle of the street, Rudd's voice, Colt's flat, and decided tone saying, "She's a person," the quiet weeks of watching and learning, the map in the journal growing page by page. She did not believe in neat design, in stories that were built toward meaning. But she was honest enough with herself to notice when a series of things connected into something she hadn't planned but recognized. The spring was smaller than she'd hoped and larger than she'd feared. It came out of a rock face about 80 feet above the valley's upper edge, a steady seep that had carved a small channel down the face and pooled in a natural depression before dispersing into the ground. In the dry season it would slow, but based on the mineral staining and the moss growth on the surrounding rock, it didn't stop entirely. That mattered. Clara climbed up to the seep and pressed her hand against the rock face and felt the cold of it. She looked down at the valley below and then back up at the source. In her head, she was calculating the slope, the distance, the volume, the rough materials it would take to line a channel that would carry this water reliably down to a distribution point where it could be split to the farms that needed it. It was possible. Not easy. Possible. She turned and looked at Colt, who was below her on the slope, watching her with his arms crossed and his hat brim casting a line of shadow across his face. "Well," he said. "It can be done," she said. He looked up at the spring, then back at her. "It's going to take more than the three of us to do it." "I know," she said. "We need the Sutters and the Reinholds and a few others. We need to start before the ground freezes." She paused. "And we need Elias's note to not come due before we have something to show people. Some reason to believe this is real." "That's the part I don't have an answer for," Colt said. "I might," she said. She climbed back down and stood beside him and looked at the valley below. The farms and fields laid out in the afternoon light. The town of Red Hollow, a cluster of roofs and smoke at its center. Harlan Briggs somewhere in there arranging things with his slow, patient certainty. "I need to talk to Vera Paulson," she said. Colt looked at her. "Vera." "She's been in this valley for 20 years, Clara said. She's watched everything. She's never once told me what she thinks about any of it, which means either she has no opinion or she has a very strong one that she's been keeping to herself." "Vera doesn't involve herself," Colt said. "She hasn't had a reason to," Clara said. "That might be changing." Ambrose Hale had come to stand beside them, and he listened to this exchange with the expression of a man who is revising his understanding of something. He looked at Clara, and then at the valley, and then at Clara again. "You know," he said in his quiet, considered way, "I had a wife who saw things the way you do. Connections other people walked past. It's a particular kind of mind." He paused. "She would have liked you." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which felt right. The three of them stood there for a moment in the afternoon light, looking down at the valley that was either already lost or not yet decided, depending on what happened next. Then they got back on their horses and rode down. Vera Paulson was in the front room when Clara came back that evening, in her usual chair with her usual cup and the book she rarely read open on her knee. The lamp made the room smaller than it was and cast a yellow light across Vera's face that showed the lines around her eyes and mouth more clearly than the daytime did. Clara sat down across from her without being invited, which she had never done before. Vera looked up from the book. She didn't say anything, which Clara had come to understand was Vera's way of giving permission. "I need to ask you something," Clara said, "and I need you to answer me honestly, not carefully." Vera set the book down. "Those are usually the same thing," she said. "In my experience, they're often not," Clara said. Something moved in Vera's expression, not quite amusement, but related to it. "What do you want to know?" 20 years you've been running this house in this town," Clara said. "You've watched Harlan Briggs build what he's built. You've watched the smaller families lose ground piece by piece. You've watched people get pushed out or bought out or just worn down until leaving seemed easier than staying." She paused. "And you've said nothing, done nothing. You've run your boarding house and kept your prices fair and watched." Vera's face didn't change. "That's not a question," she said. "The question is why," Clara said. "Because you're not a woman who doesn't see what's happening. You see everything. So either you've decided it's not your fight, or you've decided it can't be won, or there's something else. And I need to know which one it is." The silence in the room was the kind that has weight to it. Vera looked at her cup for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were steady and direct in a way that Clara hadn't seen from her before. "My husband built this boarding house," Vera said. "He died 11 years ago, February, 2 days after his 53rd birthday." Hart gave out. He was a good man who worked himself past what his body could carry because he believed if you just kept your head down and did the work, eventually the work spoke for itself. She paused. He died believing that. I watched what happened to the people he'd helped and the people he'd built relationships with after he was gone, and I understood something he never quite got to. "What?" Clara said. "That it only works that way if the people around you are playing the same game," Vera said. "Harlan Briggs is not playing that game. He never was. And a person who keeps her head down and does the work against someone like Harlan doesn't get rewarded for it. She just gets ground down quietly until there's nothing left to grind." Clara absorbed this. So you decided to survive instead. I decided to last, Vera said. There was a distinction in her voice between the two words. This house is mine, free and clear. Harlan can't touch it, and he knows it. I outlast him if I just stay standing. She looked at Clara directly. But I'm very tired of just standing. Clara leaned forward. She put the journal on the table between them and opened it to the map. Vera looked at it for a long time. She leaned closer. She traced one of the creek lines with one finger, not touching the page, just following it. How long have you been building this? She said. Since the 3rd week I was here, Clara said. And Colt's been helping. He gave me the information I was missing, Clara said. I connected it. Vera sat back. She looked at Clara with the expression of someone completing a calculation they started a long time ago. What do you need from me? She said. Money, Clara said. Not a lot. Enough to cover part of what Elias owes on the note, or enough to buy us more time. And names. The people in this town who are not Harlan's, and not afraid of him, but who haven't had a reason to move yet. Because I'm about to give them a reason, and I need to know who's worth talking to before I start. Vera picked up her cup. She drank from it slowly. Outside the window, the night had settled completely, and the main street was quiet except for a distant sound from the direction of the saloon. There are 4 people in this town Harlan hasn't bought, Vera said finally. Not counting Colt, not counting Elias, not counting the Western families. 4 people with standing and resources, who've stayed neutral because they calculated that neutrality was safer than choosing. She looked at the map. If you can show them what you showed me just now, at least 2 of them will listen. 2 is enough to start, Clara said. Vera nodded. Then she said something Clara had not expected. I have $800 put aside, she said. From the years of running this house and spending less than I earned, I have never spent it on anything because I never found anything it was worth spending on. She looked at Clara steadily. I think I've found it. Some. The weeks that followed moved with a particular kind of compressed intensity that Clara would later find difficult to describe precisely. Not fast exactly, because many of the things she was doing were slow by nature, but dense, each day carrying more weight than the days before she'd come to Red Hollow had carried. She was working at Elias's place through the mornings and into the early afternoons, doing the regular work of the operation, the animals, the fences, the irrigation that the property already had, the ongoing problem of soil compaction on the south field that she was addressing one section at a time with a technique her father had used in Missouri. In the late afternoons and evenings, she was doing the other work, talking to people, building the argument, filling in the map. Vera's list of 4 names had become the framework. The first was a man named Owen Garrett, who ran the valley's only mill, a compact, business-minded man in his early 50s who received Clara with the measured skepticism of someone who has heard many proposals and funded few of them. He listened to the water situation map without interrupting. He asked 3 precise questions about the volume calculations and the irrigation cooperative design. He said he would think about it, and 3 days later sent a message to Vera that said he was in for $500 and 2 weeks of mill labor if the project got off the ground. The second was a woman named Judith Crane, who had inherited her late husband's freight operation and had been running it herself for 4 years with a competence that Harlan had apparently not anticipated when he'd attempted, unsuccessfully, to buy her out the previous year. Judith was sharp and suspicious and asked Clara twice whether Colt Mercer had put her up to this. Clara said no both times, which was true, and Judith looked at the map and the journal calculations and said, if this works the way you say it will, Harlan loses leverage over about 60% of the farms in this valley. Yes, Clara said. And if it doesn't work, Judith said, or if Harlan moves against it before it's established, the people who backed it are exposed. Also yes, Clara said. Judith appreciated the directness. She came in for $400 and the use of 2 freight wagons for materials transport. The third name on Vera's list, a land surveyor named Colton Park, who had done work for Harlan in the past and still did, occasionally, declined. He was polite about it. He said he didn't want the trouble. Clara thanked him and left, and did not hold it against him because she understood that everyone's calculation of acceptable risk was their own to make. The fourth was a retired ranch foreman named Dutch Sayers, who had worked the valley for 30 years and now kept a small place on the eastern edge and did occasional consulting work for the bigger operations. Dutch was 71, had arthritis in both hands, and was, as far as Clara could tell, almost completely without fear. The specific fearlessness of someone who has decided they've already lost enough that what remains is less a thing to protect than a thing to use. Dutch looked at the map, asked Clara a series of questions about the spring and the proposed channel route that told her immediately he understood land and water better than most people she'd spoken to, and then said, "Who knows about this other than who you've told?" "Harlan will know eventually," Clara said. "I don't know when." Dutch nodded. "It'll be sooner than you want," he said. "He hears things." He looked at her across the table. "I've got $150, which is not much. What I've got more of is time, and I know the high ground north of the valley better than anyone alive. If you're going to build this channel, you need someone who can read that terrain in his sleep." He held up his arthritic hands. "I can't do the heavy work, but I can tell you exactly where to do it." "That's worth more than the money," Clara said honestly. Dutch smiled. The first full smile she'd gotten from anyone who wasn't Colt in a long while. "Good," he said, "because the money is not much." Elias, when Clara laid the full picture out for him, the funding, the cooperative plan, the spring, and the channel route, sat very still for a long time at his kitchen table. Fitz was in the corner, which he often was, saying nothing, which he often did. "You've been building this for 2 months, Elias said. "While doing the work you hired me for," she said. She felt it was important to say that. He waved it off, not dismissively, the wave of someone setting aside a point that wasn't the point. "The money Vera and the others have put in, it covers the note?" "Vera's 800 covers most of it," Clara said. "Owen Garrett's 500 closes the gap. We'd be asking you to sign an agreement with the cooperative for the East Pasture Creek access as part of the arrangement, meaning it doesn't just belong to you or to Harlan, it becomes part of the shared system." Elias looked at his hands. He was quiet for a while. "I've been running this place for 23 years, he said. "My wife planted the garden on the south side of the house. We raised 3 children here." He looked up. "I was about ready to believe it was ending." Clara didn't say anything, which was the right choice. "All right," Elias said, "let's do it." Fitz, from the corner, said, "Good." It was the most emphatic thing anyone had ever heard Fitz say. Harlan Briggs found out on a Thursday. Clara was at the general store when it happened. She didn't know at first that he'd found out. She was buying lamp oil and a spool of wire, routine things, and the man behind the counter, a thin individual named Harold, who had always served her with the minimum possible engagement, was bagging her purchase when Rudd came through the door. Rudd didn't see her at first. He went straight to Harold and leaned across the counter and said, low but not low enough, "Tell me where she's been going, who she's been talking to." Harold glanced at Clara. Rudd turned. The look on his face when he saw her was several things at once: surprise, calculation, and underneath both of them, something that might have been unease. Because Rudd was the kind of man who was most comfortable when he was certain of the power arrangement in a room. And something about the way Clara looked at him now, steadily, without the flinch he'd expected her to maintain, made him uncertain. "Mr. Briggs wants to see you," he said. "Tell Mr. Briggs I'm busy," Clara said. She picked up her purchase and walked out. She heard Rudd come out behind her, but she didn't turn around. She walked to the end of the block and turned the corner and found Colt standing near his horse, as they'd arranged, and she said quietly, "He knows. We need to move the first community meeting to tonight." Colt read her face and didn't ask questions. "I'll get word to the Sutters and the Reinholds. Can you get to Ambrose?" "Yes," she said. "Vera's place?" "Vera's already expecting us," she said. He was on his horse before she finished the sentence. Volkat. The meeting at Vera Paulson's boarding house that evening had 12 people in it, which was more than Clara had expected and fewer than she'd hoped for, which described most things accurately. The front room was crowded with the particular discomfort of people who were not accustomed to being in the same space with a shared purpose. Bert and May Sutter sitting close together, Carl Reinhold with his arms crossed and his expression rigorously neutral, Ambrose Hale near the back wall where he could see everyone, Judith Crane and Owen Garrett at the table with the map spread between them, Dutch Sayers in the best chair because his knees required it, Fitz in a corner, Elias beside him, Pete and Dewey from Elias's operation standing near the door, with the slightly uncertain look of men who had not been told in advance how formal this was supposed to be. Vera stood to the side and said nothing. She had made coffee and put it out, which was her contribution to the atmosphere. Clara stood at the table and looked at the room and thought about the morning Harlan had split her trunk on the street, and about the sound the axe had made, and about what she'd written in her journal that night while her candle burned down. And she thought, this is where the split went. She told them everything. Not in a rush, she had learned from watching Colt with the Sutters and Bert Sutter with his wife and Dutch with the high country terrain, that the most important things benefit from being said at the speed they need rather than the speed you want to give them. She walked them through the map, the water acquisitions, Harlan's pattern, the East Pasture note, and how it had been addressed, the spring, the proposed channel route. When she was done, the room was quiet. Carl Reinhold uncrossed his arms. He looked at Bert Sutter. Something passed between them that didn't need words. How long to build the channel? Owen Garrett said. Dutch thinks 6 weeks if we have enough hands, Clara said. 8 if we don't. We need to start before the ground freezes hard. 6 weeks puts us into late November, Judith said. Yes, Clara said. The weather in late November in this valley is not predictable, Judith said. No, Clara said. It isn't. Judith looked at her. Clara looked back. It was the kind of exchange between two people who both understand that the risk they're acknowledging is real and that acknowledging it doesn't change whether the thing needs to be done. What happens if Harlan moves against us while we're building? Carl Reinhold said. He might, Colt said from where he stood near the window. He's going to know what we're doing. He can't stop us building on the mountain land because nobody owns that section. But he can make things difficult in town. He can call in other notes if anyone here has outstanding debts to him. He can pressure the people who supply materials. He paused. I'm not going to tell you it's without risk. It is. The silence came back. Clara let it sit. She didn't try to fill it or soften it, because the people in this room were not people who needed things softened. They were people who needed to be told the truth and trusted to decide what to do with it. May Sutter spoke for the first time. My family has been on our land for 8 years, she said. We built that place with our hands. If there's a chance to keep it from being slowly taken from underneath us, I want to take that chance. She looked at her husband. Bert nodded. I'm in, Bert said. Carl Reinhold uncrossed his arms. Me also, he said. One by one, the room said yes. Not with enthusiasm, with the steady, deliberate commitment of people who have thought about what they're agreeing to and decided it's worth it. Even Pete and Dewey, who hadn't been part of any of the preceding conversations, said yes, which surprised Clara slightly and moved her more than she showed. When the room had settled, Dutch Sayers said from his chair, I want to walk the channel route next week with Clara and whoever can come. We need to agree on the line before we start cutting. He looked around the room. This is the part where we find out whether the plan works on paper or whether it works on the ground. They're not always the same. They never are, Clara said. Dutch looked at her with his old, careful eyes. No, he said. They never are. Harlan Briggs made his first move 4 days later. It was not subtle, which was itself a message, that he felt no need to be. He sent Rudd to the Garrett mill with a letter informing Owen Garrett that the mill's operating license, which was processed through the Territorial Land Office under a provision that Harlan apparently had some influence with, would be under review due to concerns about the mill's compliance with water usage regulations. The review would take approximately 60 days. Owen Garrett sent the letter to Clara. Clara read it at Elias's kitchen table with Colt across from her, and Fitz somewhere in the background doing something with a piece of harness that had come loose. He's not going to shut the mill down, Colt said. He can't, not really. The license issue is thin and he knows it. He's buying time and applying pressure. He's also sending a message to everyone who signed on, Clara said, that there's a cost. Yes, Colt said. She folded the letter. Does Owen pull out? Not Owen, Colt said. He's got money enough to weather 60 days and a lawyer who owes him a favor. He paused. It's the others I'd worry about. Carl Reinhold has a note with the Territorial Bank that he's been carrying quietly. If Harlan has reached there, I'll go see Carl, Clara said. She went that afternoon. Carl met her at the fence line of his farm, which meant he'd seen her coming and decided to meet her here rather than inside, which told her something about where his head was. I got a visitor this morning, Carl said. Not accusatory, just flat. Harlan's man? Clara said. A man from the Territorial Bank, Carl said. He was very polite. He said my note situation was under routine review. He looked at her. Routine? Carl, I am not a coward, he said, and the directness of it stopped her. I want to be clear about this. I am not pulling out because I am afraid. I am pulling out because I have Hilda to think about, and because if my note is called in while we are 2 weeks into building a mountain channel that is not yet finished, I lose my farm. I do not have Owen Garrett's resources. He looked at her steadily. I am sorry. I think what you are doing is right. I cannot afford right at this particular cost. Clara stood with that for a moment. She wanted to argue. She could see the argument, the larger picture, the longer term, the fact that yielding now only made Harlan stronger. She could see all of it. She also saw Carl Reinhold's face, which was the face of a man who had already made his calculation and knew it was the right one for his situation, and did not need her to tell him otherwise. I understand, she said. You don't owe me anything. Carl looked at her for a moment. I will not work against you, he said. I want that to be clear also. I will stay quiet. I will not let him use me against this. That's more than I'd ask, she said. She rode back toward Red Hollow, feeling the loss of it. Not catastrophically, but genuinely. Carl Reinhold was one fewer set of hands and one fewer voice, and the ripple of it would reach the others who were watching to see whether Harlan's pressure was working. She was honest with herself about that on the ride back, because she'd found that being honest about bad things early gave her more room to think clearly than discovering them later. When she got back to Vera's, she found Colt sitting on the front step with his hat on his knee and an expression that told her he'd heard. Carl's out, she said. I know, he said. Ambrose came by. He's worried. Is Ambrose out? No, Colt said. Ambrose doesn't have any notes outstanding, and his land is his own. But he's worried about the others. He looked up at her. Harlan's also been talking to some of the men we were planning to hire for the channel work, telling them the work is connected to a land dispute and that anyone who takes wages from it might find themselves on the wrong side of things later. Clara sat down on the step beside him. She was tired in a way that was partly physical and partly not. How many did he get to? She said. Hard to say, Colt said. Maybe 4 or 5 who'd been willing. They haven't said no to us directly. They're just not available suddenly. She was quiet for a moment. We can do it with fewer people, she said. It takes longer, but it's possible. Clara, Colt said, and there was something in the way he said her name that was different from his usual register. Less flat, more personal. She looked at him. I want you to think about whether the speed Harlan's moving at means we're running out of time we don't have. I've been thinking about that since the moment Rudd walked into the general store, she said. And? And I don't have a good answer, she said. We can speed up the timeline and risk the quality of the work, or we can hold the quality and risk the timeline, or… She stopped. Or, he said. Or we make the channel less ambitious in the first place, she said slowly. Not the full route Dutch mapped, a shorter version that reaches the 3 most critical farms first, Elias, the Sutters, and Ambrose, and can be extended later when we have more time and less pressure. Colt thought about that. Dutch said the shorter route is steeper, he said. More difficult to work. More difficult isn't impossible, she said. Dutch would know if it was impossible. We'd need to ask him, Colt said. Tomorrow, she said. Can you get him to the North Trailhead by morning? Yes, he said. She stood up. Then she stopped because she had been carrying a thing since the Carl Reinhold conversation, and she felt it should be said. If this goes wrong, she said, the people who get hurt most are the ones who trusted this. The Sutters. Ambrose. Elias. She looked at Colt. You. He looked at her for a long moment. I know that, he said. I'm not looking for reassurance, she said. I'm saying I know it. I want you to know I know it. I know you know it, he said. That's not actually the part that worries me. What's the part that worries you? He was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, it was with the specific honesty of someone choosing to say the real thing rather than the easier thing. That you'll decide the risk to the others is too high, he said, and you'll try to carry the thing alone to protect them from it. She looked at him. Don't do that, he said. She didn't answer immediately because the truth was he was right, and she knew it, and she needed a moment to sit with the discomfort of being read that accurately by another person. I'll try, she said finally. That's all I'm asking, he said. Dutch said the shorter route was steeper and dangerous, and the best option they had, which was Dutch's way of saying yes. He walked the revised line with Clara and Colt and Ambrose Hale over 2 days in the high ground, marking the path with stakes, identifying the 3 sections where the slope required reinforced channel walls, noting one particular traverse across a rock face that would need very careful handling because the ledge was narrow and the drop below it was significant. "This section here," Dutch said, standing at the traverse and pointing his stick at the ledge, "is where most of the risk concentrates. If the channel walls on this section fail, the whole lower route loses pressure and probably floods the exit point." He looked at Clara. "You build this right, it lasts 20 years. You rush it, you build a problem you'll spend the rest of your time fixing." "How long to do it right?" she said. 4 days on this section alone if the weather holds," Dutch said. "And if it doesn't?" Dutch looked at the sky. The sky in late October in that country looked a specific way when weather was thinking about moving in. Not dark exactly, but heavy at the edges, as though the horizon was holding something it hadn't decided to release yet. "It's going to hold for about 10 days, Dutch said. "Maybe 12. "Then we start tomorrow," Clara said. The party that assembled at the North Trailhead the following morning was smaller than Clara after Harlan's pressure. Herself, Colt, Ambrose, Bert Sutter, and his older son, Fitz and Pete, from Elias's operation, Dutch for guidance, and 2 men Clara didn't know well, brothers named Ike and Roy Cutler, who had shown up at Vera's boarding house 2 evenings before and said, simply, that they'd heard what was happening and they'd like to help. Clara had looked at them for a moment. "Why?" she'd said. The older one, Ike, had shrugged with the particular economy of a man who doesn't dress things up. "My family had a place in Nebraska," he said. "Man bought up the water rights upstream, one by one, quiet-like. By the time we understood what was happening, the place was dry. We sold for nothing." He looked at her. "We know what this is." Clara had said, "We can pay you wages for the work, but not much." Ike had said, "The wages aren't the point." They were good workers, the Cutler brothers. Methodical, strong, and without any of the friction that sometimes came with men who'd been recruited mid-project and hadn't built trust with the group yet. By the end of the first day, they had cleared and graded the first section of the channel route, a relatively gentle quarter-mile that served mostly as a warm-up for what was above it. The warm-up was misleading. The second day brought them to the first reinforced section, where the slope increased sharply, and the channel walls needed to be built, not just laid, which meant digging out foundations in ground that had rock less than 18 inches down in some places. The work was slow and physical, and required a kind of patience that the early progress had not demanded, and Clara noticed in the afternoon of that second day that the group's energy had shifted from the momentum of beginning to the harder, quieter endurance of the middle. She worked alongside them, not because she needed to prove something, but because she genuinely couldn't ask anyone to do something she wasn't willing to do herself, and because the physical work helped her think. Her shoulders ached by evening, and her hands, which were not soft to begin with after months at Elias's operation, were raw in 2 places. She didn't mention it. On the evening of the third day, sitting around the small fire they'd made above the first rest point, Dutch said, "We're moving at the right pace. I know it doesn't feel like it." "How do you know?" Bert's son, a 15-year-old named Will, asked. He was sore in the way that young people get sore when they've worked harder than they've worked before and haven't yet figured out that it passes. "Because we're building something that holds," Dutch said. "And what holds takes the time it takes." He poked the fire with a stick. "When I was your age, I wanted everything faster. Thought speed was how you won." He paused. "You win by lasting." Will looked at that, turned it over. "Is that why they call you Dutch?" he said. "No," Dutch said. "They call me Dutch because my mother was Dutch, and I can't say my actual name without getting the vowels wrong." Someone laughed, Ike Cutler, quietly, in the way that people laugh when something is true and surprising at the same time. The sound of it moved through the group and lightened something. Clara looked at the faces around the fire, tired, roughed up, completely serious in the way that people get when they're doing something they've decided matters, and felt the particular weight of being the reason they were here. Not crushing, but present. Colt was watching her from across the fire. When she looked at him, he gave a very small nod, the kind that doesn't mean everything is fine, but does mean, "I see you, and you're still standing, and that's enough for now." The storm came on the 9th day. Dutch had said 10 days, maybe 12, and the sky had been cooperative in a way that felt almost suspicious in retrospect. Clear, cold, still, the kind of late October weather that was too good to be reliable. They had reached the Traverse section on the 8th day, and were halfway through it when the temperature dropped 12 degrees in less than an hour on the morning of the 9th. Dutch felt it first. He came to where Clara was working on the channel wall and said, without preamble, "We need to get off the Traverse." She looked at the sky. The edges that had been heavy for days were now moving, not slowly. "How long?" she said. "Hours," Dutch said. "Not many." She looked at the Traverse, the narrow ledge, the channel wall half built, the drop below. They were not finished with this section. An unfinished section here meant the pressure problem he'd described, the flooding at the exit point. "We can finish it," she said. 3 hours of work." "In 3 hours that ledge might be icy," Dutch said. "It might," she said. They looked at each other. Dutch, who had been in this mountain country for 30 years, and Clara, who had been in this valley for less than 4 months, and between them a specific kind of decision that couldn't be made by adding things up because there wasn't enough information to add. "Ask the others," Dutch said. "Don't decide for them." She gathered the group on the ledge above the Traverse. The wind had started. Not hard yet, but directional, which meant the system was organized and coming with intent. She told them the situation plainly. The work was 3 hours from completion on this section. The weather was 3 hours, maybe less, from arriving. The section unfinished meant the channel had a vulnerability at its most critical point. The section finished in deteriorating conditions meant working on a narrow rock ledge in wind and potentially ice. "What's below?" Ike Cutler said, looking at the drop. "About 60 feet, Clara said. "Rock." Nobody spoke for a moment. "I'm finishing it," Colt said. Not loudly, just as a statement of fact. "Me too," said Ambrose Hale. Will Sutter said nothing, but he picked up his tool and went back to the ledge, which was an answer, one by one. Not dramatically, just people deciding what they were willing to do and doing it. Clara looked at Dutch. Dutch made the face of a man who has objected once and will not object a second time. "Then let's move fast," he said. The next 3 hours were the hardest work Clara had done in her life. Not because of any single thing, but because of the combination. The wind building steadily, the temperature dropping in increments she could feel in her hands, the precision the channel wall required in conditions that were steadily less forgiving of imprecision. Twice the wind caught material she was working with and she had to stop and recover it. Once she slipped on the ledge and caught herself on the wall with both hands, her heart loud for a moment before she got her footing back. Colt was beside her for most of it, not hovering, not getting in the way, just present in the way that made the whole enterprise slightly more possible than it would have been without him. The last stone of the Traverse wall went into place 40 minutes before the storm hit properly. They came off the ledge in the first hard gusts, moving carefully but quickly, Dutch counting heads without being asked to, all 8 of them reaching the wider trail above the Traverse before the sleet started. It came sideways, which was the worst kind, but not just cold but cutting, and it erased visibility within minutes. Dutch led them to a shelter he apparently knew about, a natural overhang about a quarter-mile up the wider trail, deep enough for all of them to be out of the worst of it, though not warm. They sat there with their backs against rock and listened to the storm work and felt the specific relief of people who had cut something very close. Clara's hands were shaking, from cold, from the released tension of the last 3 hours, from the slip on the ledge that she hadn't fully processed yet. She held them together until they steadied. Colt sat beside her, not speaking, just there. After a while, in the noise of the wind and sleet, Ambrose Hale said quietly, "The channel wall held up to those gusts." "I know," Clara said. "I was watching it." "Solid work," Ambrose said. He said it the same way he said everything, without decoration, which made it mean more. "It was everyone's work," Clara said. Ambrose looked at her. In the dim light of the overhang, his face was calm, the face of a man who has decided something and is at peace with the decision. "It was your idea," he said. "That matters. Ideas are what other people can either sit on or build from. You gave us something to build from." Clara didn't answer. She looked out at the storm and thought about the Traverse wall holding, about the $1,200 note on Elias's east pasture, about Vera's front room and the map in the journal, and Harlan Briggs somewhere in Red Hollow calculating his next move. She thought about all the pieces of this thing that were not finished yet and all the ways it could still go wrong. But the traverse wall had held. On the worst afternoon the mountain had given them, in wind and cold and fading visibility, the thing they had built had held. The storm kept them under the overhang for the better part of 2 days. Not the whole storm. By the second morning the sleet had stopped and the wind had dropped to something that was cold but no longer dangerous. But the ice it left on the upper trail made coming down before the second afternoon a risk that Dutch vetoed with the authority of someone who had seen what that particular kind of ice did to people moving quickly on mountain paths. So they stayed. They had enough food for the days they'd planned, plus a margin Clara had insisted on, and that Bert Sutter had teased her about when they were packing. He didn't tease her about it now. They slept in shifts against the rock, 2 people always keeping the small fire going that Dutch had made with the wood they'd brought up in the supply packs. The fire wasn't enough to make anyone comfortable, but it was enough to make the situation survivable, which Clara had come to understand was sometimes the only distinction that mattered. On the first evening, with the sleet still going sideways past the overhang's mouth, Will Sutter asked Dutch to tell him something about the valley from before Red Hollow was a town. Dutch had been quiet for a while and then talked for 2 hours, about the first settlers who came through in the early years, about the families who had built and failed and built again, about the water patterns he'd spent 30 years learning the way you learn the face of someone you've lived beside. He talked without performance, just a man emptying out knowledge he'd accumulated too long to carry alone. Clara listened and wrote in her journal by firelight, the kind of writing that was less about recording facts than about keeping her mind from circling the same anxious questions it wanted to circle. At some point, Colt sat beside her and looked at what she was writing and said, "You're not sleeping." "I will," she said. "When?" "When I stop thinking," she said. He looked at the journal. "Does writing stop the thinking?" "It slows it down," she said. "Gives it somewhere to go." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The traverse wall is holding. I checked it twice this afternoon while you were talking to Dutch." She looked at him. "You went back out on that ledge?" "Not all the way," he said. "Far enough to see the wall. It's fine." She should have been frustrated with him for taking the risk, and part of her was. Another part of her felt something that she didn't have a clean word for. Not gratitude exactly, not relief, something more specific than either of those, related to the feeling of being known by someone well enough that they understand which particular worry to address without being told. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Didn't make anything of it. They came down on the afternoon of the second day, moving carefully on the ice trail with Dutch in front setting the pace, and Colt at the back making sure nobody rushed it. The valley below looked different from the high ground after the storm, sharper, cleaner, every line distinct in the cold air, the farms and fields laid out with a clarity that the warmer months softened. Clara looked at it coming down and thought, "We built something up there that reaches this." The spring water would come down through the channel to the distribution point above the western farms, and from there through the secondary lines to Elias's east pasture and the Sutter operation in Ambrose Hale's 40 acres. Not all the valley, not everything, but enough of it to matter, and enough to show what was possible if the cooperative expanded the system later. They reached the valley floor in the late afternoon, cold and stiff, and not saying much to each other, which was different from the silence of the first days of the project. This was the silence of people who had been through something together and were still processing the fact that they'd come through it. Dutch, when they reached the point where the trail split toward the different farms, stopped and looked back up at the mountain. In the late light, the upper section was still white with the storm's ice. The traverse line was invisible from this distance, which was as it should be. "It'll flow when the ice breaks," he said. "Give it 2 days of sun, maybe 3. "Is the channel grade what you needed?" Clara said. "We'll know when it flows," Dutch said. "If I've been reading that terrain for 30 years and I'm wrong, I will be personally embarrassed." "Is that something that happens?" Ike Cutler said. "Twice," Dutch said. "Both times in my 20s when I was faster than I was careful." He looked at Clara. "Go sleep. You look like a person who has not slept." "I'll sleep when the water runs," she said. Dutch made the sound he made when he thought something was both true and inadvisable. "You're going to run out of conditions," he said. "Pick a rest before the rest picks you." She knew he was right. She went back to Vera's and slept 9 hours and woke before dawn, feeling the specific disorientation of someone whose body has recovered faster than their mind. She found Colt at the kitchen table when she came downstairs. He was already on his second cup of coffee and had the look of someone who had been up for a while. Vera was somewhere in the back of the house. The boarding house was quiet in the pre-dawn way that made every small sound distinct. "How long have you been up?" she said. "An hour, maybe more," he said. "Couldn't stay down." He looked at her. "You slept." "Dutch told me to," she said, which made his mouth move in the direction of a smile. She poured coffee and sat across from him, and for a moment they just sat with the quiet, which they had gotten comfortable enough with each other to do without filling it. Then Colt said, "Harlan's been busy." She set down the cup. "Tell me." "While we were on the mountain, he went to see Owen Garrett again. Not with the license thing this time, with money. He offered to buy the mill outright, above market value. Owen told him, no." He paused. "Harlan also called in a debt that Pete had with the hardware man on the north end of the street. $50. Pete didn't even know Harlan had bought that debt." "Did Pete lose anything?" she said. "No, he scraped the money together, but it shook him." Colt looked at his cup. "It's the kind of thing Harlan does. He's not trying to break people all at once. He's making the point that he has reach, reminding everyone where the edges of things are." "It's working," Clara said, not a question. "Some," Colt said. "Morrison, the salesman who boards here, told Vera he's thinking of staying somewhere else when he comes through next month. Doesn't want the association." He paused. "Harlan's been telling people in town that this cooperative project is a land scheme, that you're the front for outside investors who want to come in and buy up the failing farms cheap once Elias defaults." Clara looked at him. "Does anyone believe that?" "The people who want to believe something that makes them feel better about not helping, yes," he said. "The people who know better, no." He paused. "The people in the middle, some." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the map in her journal and all the careful pieces of information she'd assembled over months, and the 12 people who had sat in Vera's front room and the traverse wall holding in the ice and sleet, and she thought about how all of that could be rewritten in someone's mind by a story, a simple, convenient story that made the bad thing easier to accept. "We need the water to run," she said. "Yes," Colt said. "Visible results are the only argument left." 3 days, she said. He nodded. 3 days. Harlan Briggs came to see her on the second of those 3 days. She was at Elias's operation, working on the Southfield soil compaction problem she'd been addressing one section at a time. The kind of work that showed no results for weeks, and then showed them all at once, which required a faith in the process that Clara found easier to maintain than most people did. She heard the horse before she heard anything else, and then she heard Harlan's voice telling Elias something in the yard. And then Elias came to the field's edge and said, with the expression of a man who has been dreading this, "He wants to talk to you." Clara stood up from where she was working and brushed the dirt from her hands and walked to the yard. Harlan Briggs had not changed much since the morning he'd split her trunk on Red Hollow's main street. He was still large, still at ease with his own authority, still dressed in the way that money looked in frontier country. Not expensive, but deliberate. He stood in Elias's yard with his hat in his hand, which Clara recognized as a calculated gesture of civility. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I've been meaning to have a conversation with you." "I've been busy," she said. "I heard," he said. He looked around the yard, at the fields, at the neat condition of the equipment, the general evidence of work being done well. Something in his expression acknowledged this without commenting on it. "You've accomplished a good deal in a short time here." "What do you want, Mr. Briggs?" she said. He looked at her, the assessing look of a man recalibrating. When he'd stood over her broken trunk, she had been a person he was demonstrating something to the town with. She was not that same person now, and they both knew it, and the knowledge of it sat in the space between them. "I want to make you a reasonable offer," he said. "The project you've been working on up in the mountain, the channel. I've heard about it. I understand what you're trying to do." He paused. "What if I told you I was willing to contribute to it, to be part of the cooperative?" Clara looked at him for a moment. "What's the condition?" she said. "The water distribution point," he said. "The hub where the channel reaches the valley floor. I want it on my land. I'll give the cooperative full access rights in writing. I'll contribute capital to expand the system later." He spread his hands in a gesture of openness. Everybody wins. Clara looked at Elias. Elias was looking at his hat brim. She looked back at Harlan. If the distribution point is on your land, she said, then the cooperative's access depends on your goodwill. Whatever the paper says today can be renegotiated when the conditions change, when you find a lawyer clever enough, when you've waited long enough that the people relying on the water can't afford to fight it. I'm offering you a written agreement, he said, with a slight edge appearing beneath the civility. You've been building a written agreement with the McAllisters and the Dennings and the people who sold you their creek rights, she said. The writing is not the problem. The leverage is. She paused. The distribution point is going on common land. Not mine, not yours, not Elias's. Common, where it can't be used as a pressure point by anyone. Harlan's jaw tightened slightly. It was the only place the mask moved. That's not how land works out here, he said. Maybe it should be, she said. The silence in the yard had a quality to it. Not quite confrontation, but the thing that precedes confrontation, when two people have been honest enough with each other to understand exactly what they're disagreeing about. You're making an enemy, Harlan said. The civility was mostly gone now. What was underneath it was not rage. It was colder than rage, the temperature of a man deciding to be patient about something. I had the impression I already had, Clara said. He put his hat on and looked at her one more time, a long, considered look. And then he got on his horse and rode out of the yard without another word. Elias exhaled slowly. Well, he said. Yes, Clara said. You know he's going to come at this harder now, Elias said. I know, she said. But if I'd said yes, the cooperative would have been finished before it started. A year from now, he'd have found a way to use that distribution point, and everyone who depended on it would be back where they started. She looked at Elias. I'm sorry this is on your property, this conversation. Don't be, Elias said. He had the expression of a man who has been carrying a heavy thing for a long time and has recently set some of it down. You said the right thing. The water ran on the third day. It ran in the early morning, before most of Red Hollow was up, while the frost was still on the ground, and the light was the particular shade of gray-pink that comes just before the sun actually appears. Clara was already at the distribution point when it happened. She'd been there since before dawn, partly because she couldn't sleep, and partly because she wanted to see it alone first, before anyone else arrived, before it became a thing that was shared and discussed and responded to. She wanted one moment with it herself. The sound came first. Not dramatic, not a rush or a surge, but a sound like something being cleared from a throat, a gurgle that moved through the channel stones and then steadied into something continuous. And then the water appeared at the distribution point, cold and clear, running fast from the elevation gain of the channel and slowing slightly as it spread into the first collection basin they'd cut. Clara crouched beside the basin and put her hand in the water. It was very cold. It was real. She stayed crouched there for a long moment. She wasn't sure what she felt exactly. Relief was part of it, and something that was adjacent to pride but different, and underneath both of those something quieter that she didn't try to name. She thought about her father walking the edges of his fields in the early morning. She thought about the morning Harlan had split her trunk and the specific sound of the axe. She thought about Colt saying she's a person on a boardwalk in the dark. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Colt was walking toward her through the frost, his breath visible in the cold air, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who had known where she'd be and had decided to come anyway. He stopped at the basin's edge and looked at the water. There it is, he said. There it is, she said. He crouched beside her and put his hand in the water and felt it for a moment, and they were both quiet, which was right. Then he said, Dutch is going to be insufferable. She laughed, not the polite laugh of someone performing amusement, but an actual laugh, the kind that comes out of genuine release, and the sound of it in the quiet morning surprised her slightly. He deserves to be, she said. By mid-morning, the news had moved through the valley the way news moved in that country, person to person, each telling shaping it slightly differently, but the core of it arriving intact. The mountain spring water was running, the cooperative channel was working, and the distribution was reaching the first 3 farms on the western route. Ambrose Hale was the first farmer to have the water reach his land. He sent a boy to Elias's place with a note that said simply, running well, good grade. 3 words from a man who spent words carefully, which meant they carried full weight. The Sutter Farms line reached water in the early afternoon. May Sutter came to the distribution point herself, didn't send anyone, came herself, and stood for a moment looking at the basin and the channel and the high ground above where the spring was. Then she looked at Clara and said, "My son did good work up there." "He did," Clara said. "He didn't complain once." "He complained to me," May said, "every evening when he got home, but not up there." She looked at the water again. That matters. The news reaching Harlan Briggs's household, Clara heard from Vera later, produced a silence that was described by the person who'd been in the room as the kind that had furniture in it. What Harlan did with that silence was act, and he acted with the speed of a man who understands that the moment has shifted and that waiting is no longer the strongest move. Within 2 days, he had filed a complaint with the Territorial Land Office, claiming that the mountain spring and the channel route crossed land that was under disputed ownership. A claim that Dutch Sayers spent the next 72 hours systematically dismantling with 30 years of survey records, property maps, and the specific knowledge of where every boundary in the high ground actually sat. He knew it wouldn't hold, Colt told Clara when Dutch's counter-documentation went in. He just needed to create uncertainty for a few weeks, long enough to make the cooperative's funding partners nervous. "Owen Garrett isn't nervous," Clara said. "No," Colt said. "But he sent 2 messages this week asking for updates, which he didn't do before." "I'll go see him," she said. She went to see Owen Garrett and walked him through Dutch's documentation and showed him the channel flow measurements she'd been taking every morning since the water started running. Owen Garrett listened, asked questions, looked at the numbers, and said, "He's not going to win this at the land office. I knew it when I read his filing." "I know," Clara said, but the filing makes it look contested," Owen said, "and contested makes investors cautious." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not cautious. I want you to know that." "I know," she said. He leaned back in his chair. "What I am," he said, "is curious about what's next. The 3 farms you're reaching now aren't the whole valley, and Harlan still has the McAllister water rights and the Denning Creek access." "I know," she said. "Do you have a next step?" She opened her journal to a new page she'd been working on over the previous weeks. A proposal, written in the methodical way she wrote things, for expanding the cooperative's membership and the channel system to eventually reach a broader section of the valley, reducing the effective leverage of any single upstream water source. Owen Garrett read it for a long time without speaking. "This is ambitious," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "Some of it is going to depend on whether the people who sat on the sidelines come in or stay out," he said. "Carl Reinhold, the families who didn't come to the meeting." "I know," she said. "The working water is the argument. If people can see that it works, some of them will change their calculation." Owen looked at her. "Some won't," he said. "Some people, when they see someone succeed at something they chose not to help with, feel worse about it, not better. They dig in." "I've thought about that," she said. "And?" "And I can't control it," she said. "I can only control whether the thing works. If it works, the people who come around will come around. The ones who don't, I can't spend more energy on them than I have." Owen Garrett nodded slowly. "Your father teach you that too?" he said. "No," she said. "That one I learned on my own." Well, the change in town came slowly, which was how real change almost always came. Not in a single moment, not in a declaration, but in accumulations too small to point at individually that added up to something different. It started, as many things in small towns start, with a practical need overcoming a social one. A rancher named Boyd Clemens, whose operation sat on the valley's middle section, had a sick horse. Not sick the way Sable had been, but sick in a different way. A lameness that Doc Pierce had addressed twice with the same treatment, and that had not improved. Someone, Clara never knew who, told Boyd Clemens to talk to the woman at Elias Trent's place. Boyd Clemens was not a man who had laughed at her on the street. He had not been part of Harlan's circle exactly, but he hadn't been against it either. He was the type of person who existed in large numbers in every frontier town, not cruel, not courageous, existing in the space between that required no commitment in either direction. He came to Elias's place on a Saturday morning with his hat in his hand and his expression carrying the weight of someone who is choosing to ask for something from a person they should have been kinder to. Clara listened to him describe the horse's symptoms and asked 4 questions and then went to look at the animal. She spent about 20 minutes with it, watching how it moved, watching where it favored, pressing certain points along the leg to understand where the pain was concentrated. "It's not the leg," she said, "not primarily. The lameness is a symptom. The problem is how it's been shod. The shoe on the left rear is pulling the hoof at a slight angle that's been building strain into the lower back and hip over months. Every time Doc Pierce treats the leg, he's treating the result. You need a different farrier, and you need the horse rested for about 6 weeks." Boyd looked at her. "That's it?" "That's it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his horse and at Clara and at his hat in his hands. "I didn't say anything," he said. "That morning, on the street, when Harlan split your trunk." "I know," she said. "I should have," he said. Clara looked at him steadily. She thought about all the things she could say to that. The things that would have been honest, or the things that would have been kind, or the things that were neither but felt satisfying in the moment. She chose none of them. "The farrier in Millhaven is better than the one we have here," she said. "Take the horse there." Boyd Clemens nodded. He said thank you and meant it and left. She told Colt about it that evening, not with triumph. She didn't feel triumph about it, but because she felt like the conversation needed to be said out loud to someone who would understand why it was complicated. "He felt guilty," Colt said. "Yes," she said. "Did it help? Him saying it?" She thought about that honestly. "A little," she said. "Not the way I thought it would, when I imagined it, but a little." Colt looked at his coffee. "People apologize when the cost of apologizing goes down," he said. "When the side that was wrong is clearly wrong and the side that was right is clearly right. It doesn't mean the apology isn't real. It means they're human." "Is that a comfort?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "Is it?" She thought about it. "Somewhat," she said. Boyd Clemens was not the last. Over the following weeks, the incremental shift that Clara had told Owen Garrett would take time began to take it. Not wholesale, not a reversal of everything that had been, but the kind of lateral movement that happens in a community when the dominant version of a story becomes harder to maintain than the alternative. Harold at the general store started saying good morning to her, not warmly, not with any indication that he was going to mention what he'd allowed Rudd to do in his store, just good morning, the ordinary courtesy he'd withheld before. Clara returned it in kind, no more, no less. 2 families from the northern end of the valley came to ask about joining the cooperative. One of them had a water situation that the current channel couldn't address, but Clara sat down with them in Dutch and talked about what an extension of the Eastern Line would require, and the conversation itself, the fact of it happening, people sitting together and working through a practical problem, was different from anything that had existed in Red Hollow 6 months before. Vera Paulson, watching this from the front room she watched everything from, said one evening, "It's not enough to change what Harlan's already done. You know that." "I know," Clara said. She had just come in from a meeting with Judith Crane about the freight routes for the next phase of Channel Materials. "The McAllister water rights are still his," Vera said. "The Denning Creek access. He controls upstream volume on 2 of the valley's 3 main flows." "I know that too," Clara said. Vera looked at her. "You have a plan for it." It was not a question. "I have a beginning of one," Clara said. "It's not complete." "Tell me the beginning," Vera said. Clara sat down. "The McAllisters sold their water rights because they needed money for a roof," she said. "They didn't want to sell. Elmer McAllister has barely spoken to anyone in town since he did it. He's ashamed of it, and ashamed men are not the same as men who've chosen a side." She paused. "If the cooperative can offer to buy back the rights from Harlan, at the price Harlan paid, not a profit, and give the McAllisters a cooperative membership in exchange, we break his upstream position on the North Fork." "Can you afford to buy it back?" Vera said. "Not now," Clara said. "In 6 months, if the cooperative grows the way the numbers suggest it can, possibly." "And the Denning Creek access?" "The Denning family never left the valley," Clara said. "They're still on their land. They sold the creek access, but they kept the land. If we can help them challenge the sale on the grounds that they weren't fully informed of what they were transferring, the downstream consequences to their own property, there may be a legal path. That's a long fight, Vera said. Everything worth doing is a long fight, Clara said. Vera looked at her for a moment. Then she went to her writing desk and took out a sheet of paper and wrote something on it and handed it to Clara. It was the name and address of a territorial lawyer in the next county who had, according to Vera, handled 3 previous water rights cases and won 2 of them. Write to him, Vera said. The confrontation with Harlan that Clara had been expecting, the larger one, not the yard conversation at Elias's place, which had been controlled, but the one she could feel building in the way weather builds in that country, all the pressure accumulating behind a surface that seemed still, came on a Thursday in November, 3 weeks after the water had started running, at a town meeting that Harlan himself called. He called it on the grounds of discussing territorial water regulations, which was technically the subject, and which gave him the structure of official proceeding without the actual authority of one. He had the saloon cleared out and chairs arranged, and he sat at the front with 2 men, Rudd and a legal-looking individual Clara didn't recognize. And the town came, because in a small town you came to the meeting even when you knew what it was. Clara sat in the 3rd row with Colt on one side and Ambrose Hale on the other. Vera was near the back. Dutch Sayers was in the front row on the opposite side because his knees required an aisle seat, and also because Dutch put himself where he wanted to be without consulting anyone about it. Harlan opened by talking about the cooperative project in the language of concern, that he was worried, as a major landowner in the valley, about the legal status of the channel on unclaimed mountain territory, about the water volume impact on downstream rights, about whether the proper territorial processes had been followed. He used the word proper 3 times in the first 5 minutes, which told Clara something about the strategy. The legal-looking individual, whose name was Fenner, and who was apparently a territorial land agent, followed Harlan with a presentation about regulations that was technically accurate in every individual piece and assembled in a sequence designed to imply that the cooperative's channel was operating outside of proper sanction. When Fenner finished, the room was quiet in the specific way of people who are not sure how much of what they just heard was true. Clara stood up. She did not ask for permission. She did not look at Harlan. She turned to face the room and she said, "I want to show everyone something." She put her journal's page, the map she had been building since her 3rd week in Red Hollow, on the board at the front of the room that Harlan had been using for his presentation. She pinned it up with 2 nails she'd brought in her pocket. She walked through it the way she'd walked through it with the Sutters and with Ambrose and with Vera on the night she'd first asked for help. She named the creek accesses that Harlan had acquired. She named the dates. She named the prices paid and the circumstances of each sale. The Dennings needing roof money, the McAllisters needing a doctor, the small needs that had been met in exchange for things worth far more than the money. None of these sales were improper by themselves, she said. That's the point. Each one looked like a regular transaction, but assembled together, they represent the effective control of the valley's primary water supply by one person. And when one person controls the water, they control what the valley can do, what it can grow, what it can survive. She paused. The cooperative channel is not about regulations. It's about whether the people who live and work in this valley can function without asking Harlan Briggs's permission. The room was quiet in a different way now. Harlan said from the front with careful control, "Miss Whitmore is presenting a narrative designed to make ordinary business look like conspiracy." "Show me where I'm wrong," she said. She looked at him directly. "Not the legal framing, the facts. Tell me where the facts on that map are wrong." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the map, and at the room, and at the map again. "This meeting is about regulations," he said, "not about personal grievances." "With respect," Dutch Sayers said from the front row, in a voice that carried better than his age should have allowed. The lady asked a simple question. "Are the facts on that map wrong?" The silence stretched. Boyd Clemens, from 2 rows back, said, "Are they wrong, Harlan?" It was not a hostile voice. It was the voice of a man who has been staying neutral for a long time and has gotten tired of it. The voice of someone choosing, quietly, in a room full of people, without drama. Harlan looked at Boyd. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite anger, not quite surprise, but the specific recalculation of a man who has just discovered that the room is not what he thought it was when he called the meeting. The meeting is adjourned, Harlan said. He walked out, and Fenner followed him, and Rudd followed Fenner, and the door closed, and the saloon sat with 30 people in it looking at Clara's map on the board. Owen Garrett spoke first. I think, he said in his measured way, that we should discuss expanding the cooperative membership. People talked for an hour after that. Clara mostly listened, asking questions and taking notes, because the talking itself was the point. People who had been sitting in their separate calculations for months suddenly in the same room working through the same problem, and the sound of it was different from anything that had existed in Red Hollow's public life in a long time. Colt did not say much. He sat beside Clara and listened. And once, when she was writing something in her journal and the room had gotten loud with overlapping conversation, he leaned toward her and said quietly, "You knew he'd walk out." "I thought he might," she said. "That was the point, wasn't it?" he said. It was not a question. "He called the meeting to establish authority," she said. "The only way to break that was to make him leave it. A man who walks out of his own meeting in front of his own town loses something he can't easily take back." Colt looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to know well, the one that was not quite a smile, but contained everything a smile would have. "Your father teach you that?" "No," she said. "Harlan did." The morning after Harlan walked out of his own meeting, Red Hollow felt different. Not transformed. Clara was too careful a person to use that word, even in her own thinking, but different in the specific way that a room feels different after a window has been opened. The same walls, the same furniture, but something moving through it that wasn't there before. She noticed it when she walked to the general store at first light, and Harold said good morning before she did. She noticed it in the way two men she didn't know well nodded at her on the street, with the nod that means something, rather than the nod that means nothing, small things. But she had learned in Red Hollow that small things were how the large things announced themselves. What she also noticed, because she was honest about the full picture, was that Harlan's horse was still tied outside his property every morning, that Rudd still walked the main street with the posture of a man who believed his authority was intact, and that the territorial land agent Fenner had not left town. He was staying at the hotel on the north end and taking his meals quietly and writing letters, presumably to someone who had the ability to make decisions about water rights disputes in the territorial office. Colt had found this out from the hotel's cook, who found it out from the woman who cleaned the rooms, which was how information moved in a small town when it didn't want to move through official channels. "What's he writing?" Clara said. "Don't know the content," Colt said, "but the volume suggests he's building a case." "For Harlan." "Who else?" She thought about the territorial lawyer whose name Vera had written down, the one in the next county who had won 2 of 3 water rights cases. She had written to him the week before. She had not yet heard back. She wrote again that evening, more urgently, and sent it with the morning's mail rider. The lawyer's name was Aldous Crane, no relation to Judith, and he arrived 12 days later on a Wednesday afternoon, stepping off the stage with a leather satchel that looked like it had been to more difficult places than Red Hollow, and a face that was, as far as Clara could tell, constitutionally unable to be impressed by much. He was in his mid-50s, thin, with the slightly worn quality of a man who had spent too many years sitting at desks in inadequately heated rooms. He shook Clara's hand with the grip of someone who didn't make a production of things and said, "Show me the map." She took him to Vera's front room and spread the journal open on the table and walked him through everything. The way she'd walked so many people through it by now. The water acquisitions, the sequence, the cooperative channel, the township meeting, Fenner's continued presence. Crane listened without interrupting, asked 4 precise questions when she finished, wrote 2 things in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket, and said, "The land agent's filing is thin, but it's not nothing. There's a provision in the Territorial Water Code from 14 years ago that technically requires a cooperative water project above a certain elevation to register with the land office before commencing construction." Clara's stomach dropped slightly. "We didn't know about that provision," she said. "Most people don't," Crane said, without making her feel stupid for it. "It was written to address mining operations in the high country and almost never applies to agricultural projects. Harlan's lawyer has found it and is using it creatively." He paused. "The good news is that creative use of obscure provisions tends not to survive scrutiny from someone who actually knows the code." The bad news is that Fenner's been building a paper record for 2 weeks and we're behind him. Can you catch up? She said. I've caught up from worse, he said, but I need access to the channel construction records, the land survey documentation Dutch Sayers has been building, and a formal statement from every member of the cooperative about the nature and purpose of the project. He looked at her. Can you get those? Yes, she said. By Friday? By Thursday, she said. Crane looked at her over his notebook. Good, he said. She spent the next 2 days moving through the cooperative members the way she'd once moved through the valley, with a trowel looking for what was underground, methodical, patient, taking what she found and building from it. Every member gave her their statement. Dutch produced his survey documentation in a leather roll that smelled of old paper and careful storage, and turned out to be the most comprehensive record of the Mountain Territory's boundaries anyone had seen in 30 years. Elias found the original receipts for the channel materials. Even Pete and Dewey, who had never been asked to produce documentation for anything in their working lives, sat at Elias's kitchen table with a concentration that was almost painful and wrote out what they'd done on the mountain and when and why. Fitz, asked for his statement, wrote 3 sentences in handwriting that was surprisingly precise. Clara read them and thought that 3 sentences from Fitz probably carried as much weight as 3 paragraphs from anyone else. She delivered everything to Crane by Thursday evening. Crane spent Friday going through it at Vera's table, while Vera periodically refreshed his coffee without being asked, which was the most hospitality Clara had ever seen Vera extend to anyone. By Friday evening, Crane had drafted the cooperative's formal response to Fenner's filing, a counter-registration that turned the obscure provision on its head by demonstrating that the cooperative's project not only met but exceeded the land office's requirements under the same code, and that Harlan's own creek acquisitions, specifically the manner in which the Denning and McAllister transfers had been structured, raised questions about compliance with a separate provision requiring full disclosure of downstream impact in water rights sales. That second part, Clara said, reading it. You're using the code against the acquisitions. I'm pointing out that it applies, Crane said. What the land office does with that is their decision, but it reframes the proceeding. He looked at her. Harlan came to this meeting expecting to put you on the defensive. This puts him there instead. Will it work? She said. The registration counterfiling will work, Crane said. The acquisition challenge is a longer fight. Maybe 6 months, maybe a year. It depends on who's sitting at the Territorial Land Office and whether they have the patience for a genuine review. What are the chances? She said. Crane looked at her with the direct eyes of a man who didn't believe in giving people more comfort than the situation warranted. 50-50, he said. Maybe slightly better because the documentation Dutch Sayers has assembled is unusually good and the pattern of the acquisitions is unusually clear when you lay it all out. He paused. The McAllister situation in particular. If the McAllisters are willing to testify that they weren't informed of the downstream consequences when they sold, that's significant. I'll talk to Elmer McAllister, Clara said. Elmer McAllister was a man she had never spoken to directly. She knew him by sight, a tall, angular figure in his early 60s who moved through Red Hollow's street with the particular quality of someone trying to be unremarkable, as though if he took up less space, the thing he was ashamed of would be smaller too. She went to his farm on a Saturday morning, alone, without Colt, because she thought this was a conversation that shouldn't arrive with witnesses. He met her at the fence line. People always seemed to meet her at fence lines, and looked at her with the expression of someone who already knows why a person has come and has been dreading the moment. Miss Whitmore, he said. Mr. McAllister, she said. I want to be honest with you. I'm not here to make you feel worse about the North Fork sale than you already do. He was very still. Then why are you here? Because there may be a legal path to get it back, she said. Not by giving Harlan what he paid, by demonstrating that when you sold the water rights, you weren't told what the downstream consequences would be for your own remaining land. She paused. Did anyone explain to you before you signed that losing the North Fork access would reduce the water volume on your south field by roughly a quarter in a dry summer? Elmer McAllister looked at the fence post his hand was resting on. No, he said. They told me it was just the creek rights, the access, that I'd still have my land. You still have your land, she said, but the land's value depends partly on water access you no longer have. I know that, he said. The words came out with the weight of something he'd been carrying in silence. I've known that since about 3 weeks after I signed. If you're willing to give a statement to our lawyer, Clara said, describing what you were and weren't told before the sale, it becomes part of a legal challenge to how the acquisition was structured. It doesn't guarantee anything. It's a long fight. She looked at him steadily. But it's a path. Elmer McAllister looked out at his fields. They were well-kept fields. You could see that from the fence, the care in them, the work of years. He looked at them for a long moment, the way a person looks at something they built with their hands when they're afraid of what might happen to it. My wife cried when I told her what I'd done, he said. She didn't yell at me. She just cried. That was worse. Clara didn't say anything. This was a moment that didn't need words from her, just room for his. I'll give the statement, he said. Crane filed the counter-registration with the Territorial Land Office the following Tuesday. He also submitted the formal acquisition challenge, supported by Elmer McAllister's statement, the Dutch Sayers survey documentation, and a legal argument that took the same code Harlan had tried to use against the cooperative and turned it into a framework for reviewing whether the Creek acquisitions had been properly conducted. The response from the Territorial Office was not fast. Nothing in the territorial system was fast. But when it came, 3 weeks later, it was not dismissive. The Land Office acknowledged the counter-registration and formally recognized the cooperative channel's operating status, which was the immediate practical victory. The channel's legal position was secure, and Fenner had no ground left to stand on regarding the cooperative's construction. The acquisition challenge was assigned to a review process that Crane said would take time, but was genuinely underway, which was more than he'd expected from the first filing. Fenner left town the week after the Land Office's acknowledgement arrived. He left quietly, early in the morning, which was how Clara knew it. Not because anyone told her he was going, but because his horse was gone from the hotel by the time the main street was busy. Harlan did not leave. She had not expected him to. A man like Harlan Briggs did not pack up and go because a legal filing went against him. He recalculated and waited, which was what he had always done, and which he was apparently willing to do indefinitely. What changed was not Harlan. What changed was the town's relationship to him. It happened in stages, and it was not clean because nothing in a community is clean. There were people who had depended on Harlan's money and couldn't simply stop, and those people stayed close to him even as they were quieter about it. There were people who had disliked him privately for years and now felt able to show it, which sometimes looked like courage and sometimes looked like opportunism, and was usually both. There were people who simply shifted, not dramatically, not with announcement, from one way of existing in Red Hollow to another. The cooperative grew, not explosively. It added members the way the channel added water, steadily and in proportion to what the system could actually support. By the end of November, there were 11 member farms. By December, there were 14. Carl Reinhold came back in December, which surprised Clara and then didn't, because Carl was the type of man who was slow to move and then moved fully once he decided. He came to her at Elias's place on a cold morning and said, without preamble, "I want to rejoin." "All right," she said. "I don't have an excuse," he said. "I had reasons. They were real reasons. But I also watched from a safe distance while other people took the risk, and that is not something I'm comfortable with." "Carl," she said, "you stayed quiet when you could have worked against us. That mattered." He looked at her with the expression of a man who appreciated the grace of what she'd just said and was not going to let himself fully accept it. "I should have done more," he said, "so I will do more now." He was as good as his word. Carl Reinhold became one of the cooperative's most consistent working members. Not a leader, not a voice at meetings, but the person who showed up for the physical work without being asked twice, which was in its own way the most valuable thing a group could have. The acquisition challenge moved through the territorial review process over the winter months, and Crane kept Clara informed by letter with the regularity and precision of a man who understood that the people who'd hired him had a right to know what was happening with their situation. The reviews were slow and procedural and required documentation responses that Clara and Dutch assembled methodically, the same way they'd assembled everything, carefully, completely, without assuming that good intentions were a substitute for accurate paperwork. In March, the Territorial Land Office issued a preliminary finding. Crane brought it himself this time, rode out from the next county on a gray morning that couldn't decide whether it wanted to snow or clear, and sat at Vera's table with the document and his coffee and read it through once before he said anything. The North Fork acquisition, he said. The McAllister sale. The review found procedural deficiencies in how the downstream impact was disclosed at the time of the transaction. Clara sat very still. What does that mean in practice? It means the sale is subject to remediation, Crane said, which in this instance means Harlan has the option to either renegotiate the terms of the acquisition with the McAllisters under the proper disclosure requirements, or the Land Office has the authority to require a partial restoration of water access rights to the McAllister land. He won't renegotiate voluntarily, Clara said. No, Crane said, but the Land Office doesn't need his cooperation for the partial restoration order, that they can compel. He paused. The Denning situation is different. The procedural case there is weaker, and the review found less clearly in our favor. That one will need to appeal, and it will take another 6 months at minimum. But the North Fork, Clara said. The North Fork is moving toward a restoration order, Crane said. I'd estimate 2 months before it's formalized. Clara looked at her hands on the table. She thought about Elmer McAllister at his fence line, the way he'd said my wife cried when I told her. She thought about the map in her journal and the line she'd drawn marking the North Fork water and what it meant to the valley's upstream balance. Does Elmer know? She said. I'll tell him on my way out of town today, Crane said. Can I come with you? She said. Crane looked at her. It's your case, he said. Yes. Elmer McAllister opened his door when they knocked and looked at Crane and then at Clara, and something moved across his face that he pressed down quickly, the way people press down things that are too large for a doorstep. Crane told him what the finding said. He told him what it meant. Elmer was quiet for a long time. His wife, who had come to stand in the hallway behind him, put her hand on his shoulder and left it there. 2 months, Elmer said. Approximately, Crane said. Elmer nodded. He looked at Clara. You didn't have to do this for us, he said. We weren't part of your cooperative. We weren't at the meeting. The valley works as a whole, or it doesn't work, Clara said. It was something she'd said before and believed more each time she said it. Your North Fork water is part of the whole. Elmer's wife, whose name was Bess and who had not been formally introduced to Clara before this moment, said from the hallway, Come inside, I'll make something hot. They went inside. What? Spring came to Red Hollow. The way. Spring came to that country, argumentatively, 2 warm days followed by a freeze, then a week of mud followed by the first real warmth, the land deciding at its own pace that the worst was behind it. The cooperative channel, which had slowed through the hard freezes of January and February, ran fully again by mid-March, and the distribution to the member farms was consistent in a way that the first autumn flows had promised, but couldn't yet prove. Elias Trent walked his east pasture in April for the first time in 2 years without the particular anxiety that comes from a man who is afraid the ground beneath him belongs, in some meaningful sense, to someone else. The note had been retired. The pasture was his. The creek running through it was part of the cooperative system, which meant it was, in the specific legal and practical sense that Crane had formalized, everyone's and no one's in the way that mattered. He didn't say much about it. Elias wasn't a man for speeches or declarations. He walked the pasture in the morning and came back and poured 2 cups of coffee and gave one to Clara, who was at the kitchen table going over the spring planting calculations for the south field, and said, The grass is coming in well on the east side. The drainage work from last fall is holding, she said. You should see good growth through June. He sat down across from her. He looked at his coffee. I've been thinking about what to do with the back 40, he said. The section I've never been able to use because of the water access issue. What are you thinking? She said. Expand the herd, he said. Slowly. Do it right. He paused. Might need someone who understands how to manage the grazing rotation so the land doesn't wear out. He looked at her. Someone with experience thinking about things in the long term. Clara looked at him. Elias, she said, are you asking me to stay on permanently? I'm asking if you want to, he said. It's not the same thing. She thought about it. Not for long because she'd been thinking about it in the background for some time already. She thought about the map in her journal and everything it had taken to build what now existed, and about the Denning challenge still moving through the appeals process, and about the 14 cooperative members and the conversation she was in the middle of about expanding the eastern line. She thought about Vera's front room and Dutch Sayers' arthritic hands, and the way Ambrose Hale had said it was your idea, in the shelter of the overhang while the storm went past. "Yes," she said. "I want to." Elias nodded. He drank his coffee. "Good," he said. "We'll sort out the terms." The terms they sorted out over the following week were fair, fairer than Clara expected, which told her that Elias had been thinking about them for a while before he asked. She would take a stake in the operation, not just wages. Small, to start, with room to grow. It was the kind of arrangement that asked something of both people, which was the only kind she trusted. Colt found out about the arrangement from Elias before Clara had a chance to tell him, which was fine. She'd half expected that, knowing how information moved in small spaces between people who trusted each other. He came to find her at the distribution point on the afternoon she'd spent checking the channel flow measurements, which she did every week with a consistency that the cooperative members had started calling her Tuesday habit, even on weeks when it wasn't Tuesday. He sat on the low wall that Dutch and the Cutler brothers had built around the collection basin, which had evolved from a purely functional structure into something more permanent over the winter as people added to it and shored it up and made it, without anyone deciding to, a place you went to check on things. "Elias told me," he said. "I know," she said. She was writing in her journal, the flow numbers, the water level marks. "You're not surprised?" "No," he said. "Are you?" "Not really," she said. "This is where the work is." He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon was warm enough that the frost was gone from the ground, but not warm enough yet that you forgot winter had been real. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked up from the journal. "I've been thinking about it since about October," he said. "Which means I've been thinking about it for about 5 months longer than I usually think about anything before I say it, so I figure at this point the thinking is done." She waited. He wasn't a man who dressed things up. She'd known that from the first evening on the boardwalk, from the way he'd said she's a person with the flatness of something that had already been decided. "I'd like to build something here," he said, "with you. Not because you need someone to build it with you. You've made that pretty clear you don't. But because I think it would be better with both of us in it than with one. And I think you think that too, and I don't see much point in either of us pretending otherwise." Clara looked at him. She felt the particular quality of this moment. Not the overwhelming rush that stories sometimes described, but something quieter and more solid, like a foundation being recognized rather than laid for the first time. Because in some sense it had been laying itself for months in every conversation and every silence and every moment on a mountain ledge in wind and ice, where she had known without looking that he was beside her. "You're right," she said. "I think that too." "So," he said. "So," she said. He nodded. That was it. That was them. It would have looked anticlimactic to anyone watching, and it was exactly right for what they were. The Territorial Land Office's formal restoration order on the McAllister North Fork water rights came in May, which was 2 weeks later than Crane had estimated, but arrived with a thoroughness that more than compensated. The order required not just the partial access restoration Crane had anticipated, but a full review of the terms of the original sale, which effectively returned the water rights to the McAllisters pending a new transaction conducted under proper disclosure requirements. Harlan contested it. Of course he did. But his contest was filed with the same territorial office that had just issued the order, and it was handled by the same reviewer who had read Dutch Sayers' documentation and Elmer McAllister's statement, and it was evaluated on its merits, and its merits were not strong enough. The North Fork water rights were restored to the McAllister land in June. On the day the formal order was posted at the territorial office, word of which reached Red Hollow by the afternoon mail. Clara was at the Elias's south field, working on the rotation plan she'd been developing since the spring thaw. She heard about it from Pete, who had heard it from Dewey, who had gotten the message from the mail rider with an alacrity that suggested he'd been watching for it. Pete told her with a careful neutrality that she recognized as his way of feeling things without showing them, and she accepted it with a similar economy, and then she went back to the rotation plan because the rotation plan needed finishing. But that evening, walking back through the east pasture where the grass was coming in strong and green on the ground that had been compacted dead 2 seasons before, she stopped and stood in the middle of it for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. Not just the legal order. The whole thing from the morning Harlan had put his boot on her mother's quilt to the spring water running down from the mountain to the land office document that said the valley's water could not be held by one person's patience and money. She stood there until the feeling had run through her completely, and then she kept walking. Harlan Briggs did not leave Red Hollow that summer, or the summer after. Clara had not expected him to. He still owned property in the valley, and he still had money, and he still had the particular persistence of a man who had built his position over many years and was not going to dismantle it because one project had gone against him. He was simply no longer the organizing principle around which everything else arranged itself. That was different from being defeated in the clean narrative sense. It was more real than that. He spoke to Clara directly once, in August of that first summer, outside the general store where Harold now greeted her without calculation. Harlan was coming out as she was going in, and they stopped, and there was a moment where the street existed around them, and neither of them pretended it didn't. "You've built something," he said. There was no grace in it, no admission. It was the statement of a man cataloging a fact. "We've built something," she said. "A lot of people." He looked at her for a moment with the same assessing quality he'd had since the beginning, but the frame around it had changed. She was not the woman with the broken trunk now. She was not the person he was demonstrating something to. She was someone he was recognizing, without pleasure, as a permanent feature of the landscape he operated in. "It won't run perfectly," he said. "Nothing does," she said. He walked on. It was not reconciliation. It was not resolution in the tidy sense. It was two people who understood each other clearly and would likely spend years in a community together with that understanding between them, neither friendly nor at open war. Clara could live with that. She'd learned that the world rarely handed you the clean ending and that the real endings looked more like this: functional, unromantic, the combatants still in the same town, and the outcome still being written slowly in the everyday work of things. The Denning Creek Access Challenge was resolved the following spring, not with the full restoration that the McAllister case had achieved, but with a formal easement requirement that guaranteed the Denning family continued access to the creek on their own land, regardless of who held the downstream rights. It was partial. It was real. Crane wrote to Clara that it was the best outcome available under the specific circumstances, and she wrote back that she understood, because she did. The cooperative by then had 21 member farms. Dutch Sayers had spent the winter drawing up plans for an eastern extension of the channel system that would eventually reach a section of the valley they hadn't been able to address in the first build, and he had done this with the focused energy of a man who had found, in his 70s, a project large enough to be worth the time he had left for it. Clara had found something she hadn't looked for when she came to Red Hollow, had not, in truth, let herself look for, because looking for things you want and being disappointed in frontier country was a particular kind of damage that took a long time to repair. She had found work that was fully hers, in land that she understood down to its particular stones and clay layers and the specific way it held water after a hard rain. She had found people who knew her name and used it without the weight of judgment it had carried when she first arrived. She had found Colt, which she thought about in the quiet way she thought about the things that mattered most. Not often on the surface, but always somewhere underneath. They were married in October of that second year, in the front room of Vera Paulson's boarding house, because it was where most of the significant things in Clara's Red Hollow life had happened, and it seemed right to add this one. Vera had made coffee and set out food and accepted the thanks she received with the expression of a woman who was not accustomed to being thanked and was working on tolerating it. Dutch Sayers sat in the best chair. Ambrose Hale came and stood against the back wall and said nothing through the whole proceeding, which was exactly what you'd want from Ambrose. Elmer McAllister came with his wife Bess. Bess cried, which surprised Clara, and then didn't. Carl Reinhold came with Hilda and shook Colt's hand for a long time without speaking, the way men in that country express things they didn't have words for. The Sutters came, all of them, including Will, who was now a head taller than he'd been on the mountain, and carried himself with the beginning of the confidence of someone who has done hard work and knows it. It was not a grand occasion. It was a room full of people who had been through something together, gathered in a house that had been through things of its own, on a piece of frontier that was neither beautiful nor brutal on any given day, but was usually some combination of both. Clara stood in the middle of it and felt its realness, the imperfect, specific, hard-won realness of a life built in a difficult place with people who had reasons not to trust each other and had chosen, in most cases and most of the time, to do it anyway. There is something that the story of Clara Whitmore in Red Hollow shows, and it is not what it might appear to be on the surface. It is not a story about a woman who was underestimated and proved her worth. That framing puts the crowd at the center of things, makes the crowd's opinion the measure, makes their eventual recognition the point. It isn't. The point is that Clara never stopped doing the work because of what the crowd thought. She didn't work to change their minds. She worked because the work was real, and the valley needed it, and she was the person who could see what needed doing. The change in how they saw her was a consequence. It was never the goal. This matters because most of us, at some point, are the person standing in the middle of a street with their broken things in the dirt, while someone with more power and more noise decides publicly what we're worth. And the instinct in that moment, the very human, very understandable instinct, is to make proving them wrong the organizing principle, to let their judgment become the frame that everything else fits inside. Clara didn't do that. Not because she was above it. She felt the humiliation fully, carried it, had nights on that thin mattress where it was the loudest thing in the room. But she kept returning to the question that mattered. What does this land need? What can I see that others are walking past? What is the actual problem, and what does it actually require? That shift, from what do they think of me to what does the work require, is not easy to make and not permanent once made. It has to be remade, over and over, in small moments and large ones. Clara remade it on the traverse ledge in sleet and wind when her hands were shaking. She remade it in Harlan's yard when she could have taken his offer and called it a win. She remade it every morning she got up and went back to the field. Colt Mercer understood this about her from very early, which is why he said what he said on that boardwalk and meant it the way he did. Not she's impressive or she's stronger than she looks. She's a person, which means she has the same right as anyone else to stand in this place and do the work she can do. That's all. That's everything. The frontier was hard on people who needed approval to function. It was survivable for people who could find their direction from something other than the crowd's reaction. Not easy? Survivable. Clara was not a person who made the frontier look easy. She made it look like what it was, something that could be endured and shaped and lived in fully by someone willing to pay attention and stay long enough to understand what they were actually dealing with. The valley that Red Hollow sat in did not become a paradise. Harlan Briggs's money did not disappear. The land remained difficult, and the winters remained real, and there were dry summers where even the cooperative's best planning was tested past what any plan could guarantee. People left and new people came, and the community shifted as communities do, without asking permission and without arriving at any final settled form. But the water ran from the mountain through the channel to the distribution point and out through the eastern and western lines to 21 farms, and then more. And the land that had been slowly drying out under one man's patient accumulation of control began instead to be what it had always had the capacity to be: ground that fed people, that sustained families, that held the weight of lives built on it with care. Clara kept the journal. She filled 3 more of them over the following years, the same way she'd filled the first, with observations, with maps, with the kind of notes that look like records but are really a person's way of staying honest about what they're actually seeing versus what they expect to see. She gave them to no one while she was alive and left instructions that they should go to the cooperative's record-keeping when she was done with them, because the information in them belonged to the land and the people who worked it, not to her specifically. She was not a legend in her own time, which is to say, she was not simplified. The people who knew her whole, her stubbornness, which was real, and her occasional inability to let a problem rest even when resting would have been healthier, and the way she could be wrong about something and take longer than she should have to admit it, and the fact that she was harder on herself than on anyone else, which Colt spent years noting in a tone that was more fond than critical, but was also genuinely critical, because he was the person allowed to do that. What she was, in the valley and in the town, and in the years the cooperative ran under the framework she'd built, was present, fully, consistently, without performing it, the kind of present that does the actual work rather than the version of the work that looks good from a distance. The street where Harlan Briggs had split her trunk became, over the years, the street where people who were new to Red Hollow were told what the valley had been through and what it had come through. Harold, who had gotten older and slightly less guarded, was usually the one who told them, with the compressed pride of someone claiming participation in a thing he'd mostly observed from a safe distance. Clara had never corrected this. Correcting it would have cost more than the correction was worth. Vera Paulson, asked once by a new boarder who Clara Whitmore was, looked up from her book and said, "The person who figured out what the valley needed and then went and did it." The boarder waited for more. "That's it," Vera said, and went back to her book. It was, Clara would have agreed, exactly enough.